If there's one major indictment of our current era, besides the chocolate syrup they serve with the brownies at Domino's Pizza that's like dipping them in slightly viscous water, it's anti-intellectualism. It's been on the rise ever since the word scientist started comfortably fitting after the word mad. But you know what? You're not meeting everyone else halfway, scientists, when you go around saying, my education is based on the groundwork of tens of thousands of years of progress and strict scientific rigor, and that is why I'm a better authority on my sphere of expertise than a suburban housewife who half remembers a Facebook post she read once. Well, that's the kind of superior attitude that makes people stop vaccinating their kids out of spite. If you want to start turning things around, science, I can think of one place to start. Stop ruining everyone's fun when it comes to dinosaurs. I've never met a dinosaur that a scientist hasn't tried to ruin. Jurassic Park comes out and everyone's enjoying the T-Rex and the Velociraptors, but then Johnny Scientist jumps up and goes, actually we did a little bit more science, and we've learned that Velociraptors were 2 foot tall and feathered and could be trained to fetch slippers. Also, the T-Rex was more of a scavenger than a hunter, and all the other dinosaurs used to bully it and knock its schoolbooks out of its tiny, pathetic arms. Well, for the record, Jurassic World evolution is staying consistent with the films, with Velociraptors being the prickliest little madams in the daycare centre, which kind of compromises its usefulness as a learning resource, and that's a shame, because the whole fun and entertaining to play thing didn't work out either. But let's not oversalt the pudding before the first thrust. Jurassic World generic subtitle is a business management sim wherein our task is to wave our corporate bodies at the lessons of history and build a bunch of all new dinosaur parks for rich white tourists to come and look at who I guess aren't satisfied with just taking a nice holiday on an unspoiled tropical island. No, they've got to see some perversions of nature as well, so that Mrs. Klebold from next door doesn't show them up again with her pictures from her trip to Euro Disney. So we're given an island, and we usually kick off by building a simple enclosure with some nice boring unfussy dinosaurs who don't mind posing for selfies, stick a gift shop opposite so the plebs can buy Struthiomimus t-shirts, and wait for enough money to accrue that you can build something sexier. And you know what? The park executives in the films must have spent all their time coked to the eyebrows, because it turns out stopping dinosaurs from escaping is easy peasy Murdoch sleazy. If only Richard Attenborough had known that you just have to click on each dinosaur and a bunch of meters will pop up showing exactly what makes them comfortable with regards to enclosure size, terrain type, diet, whether you're piping in death metal or Barry Manilow, etc. You have the omnipotence of a fickle creator god when it comes to landscaping, so all you have to do is adjust the environment according to their preferences, and they instantly stop banging their heads on the walls and become nice as pie. You don't even need the electrified barrier at that point, a white picket fence will keep them in. Having said that, earlier on, before I noticed the stat screen and had one or two incidents where I didn't notice a small gap in the fence because I couldn't see it through the fucking trees, I did have a couple of escape incidents. This was when I discovered there is literally fuck all you can do about escaped dinosaurs if you haven't got a helipad. Only helicopters can tranquilize the slippery little fucks, so if it's still early and you can't afford one yet, then all you can do is hope to God it just wants to steal the candy floss and get in a few photo bombs. I had jeeps for days, each one equipped with a dude with a dart rifle, but the only darts you can fire from jeeps are healing darts, and that's sending entirely the wrong message to a Ceratosaurus that's chewing on the bottom 2/3 of a little screaming lawsuit in waiting. So if I were you, I'd stick to herbivores until you've got a helipad, because I guess there's some real arbitrary dickishness going on at the dart rifle firers union. Carnivores are just complete pricks. That's another thing I had to learn early on. Don't put carnivores and herbivores in the same enclosure. Oh really, Yards? Thanks for the insider tip. Don't forget to remind us not to mistake an orbital sander for a wanking sock. Alright, it seems obvious now. I just assumed it'd be fine as long as everyone was high on comfort and had readily available food. But nope, carnivores just have the prick gene and will murder any herbivore it sees, even if it's full, content and getting regular pedicures. But after you learn these lessons, running the parks is very straightforward. And here we get to the central awkward truth of Jurassic World Ebola virus, that the interesting part of Jurassic Park the film was not the part where everything was going swimmingly. To spice things up, we're given tasks by our 3 company divisions: the Science Division, who think we're running a research facility, the Entertainment Division, who think we're running a theme park, and the Security Division, who I guess think we're running a prison for dinosaur drug dealers or something. Complete a task for one and you'll lose points with the other 2, which feels like drawing things out unnecessarily and doesn't point to a terribly healthy work environment, but it's particularly odd when they all give you the same tasks. Entertainment Man says Hadrostegosaurus because people think they're cool. Science Lady says Hadrostegosaurus because we need to research how cool they are for science. And Security Dude says Hadrostegosaurus because we're going to put targets on its backplates and use it as a firing range. Actually, I don't mind the missions because I like business sims to be goal-oriented. Don't see much appeal in just sitting on a perfectly functional park, accruing more imaginary money than I know what to fantasize about doing with. But at the same time, I do think Jurassic World Electric Boogaloo is a bit thin and lacking the personal touch. All the spaces you're given to develop in are kind of pokey, and the range of buildings is small and low on options. There is one and only one kind of restaurant you can stamp out when your park is scoring low on food availability. It is simply named Fast Food, and I assume it sells everything in featureless grey packaging like an Australian tobacconist. You can rename your Brontosaurus Sergeant Bellend and paint him in khaki brown instead of khaki green, and that's about it as far as personalisation goes. But he'll still have infinitely more personality than the human guests. Human beings just seem to grow on the walkways like a fungus. You get money just from Captain Generic's tolerable fast food emporium existing, and not from how many individual guests pass through it, which I guess is fine, but it does mean it's hard to sympathise when the attractions bust out and start chewing on them. Even more so when they all gamely come straight back the moment the threat is gone. Already thinking about what a funny story this will make when they explain it to Child Protection Services. I don't know, I guess I just like to know who a person is as I'm picking their dentures out of the T-Rex's litter box. So at E3 everyone saw that Resident Evil 2 was getting remade, and everyone hopped smartly onto their backs and began squeezing out great big fruity woofers to express their glee, but my woofers stayed resolute absolutely where they were, and yes, it was actually very uncomfortable, because I'm aware that the Resident Evil series follows a pattern. They put out one good game, and then they proceed to churn out inferior sequels until they can churn no more, making what was once a perfectly straightforward standalone horror plot into a nightmarishly convoluted mess of canon ever expanding like fresh vomit on a tile floor, making everyone in the room nauseous and creating vomity spin-offs to make the matter worse, until finally someone takes a self-awareness pill, locks themselves in a vomit-proof basement, and makes another good one, usually by stripping things down to core concepts and keeping the shit-smeared hippo of established canon out of its virgin waters. And then, the moment it does well, Capcom goes, phew, time to get back on track, and the shit-smeared hippo promptly belly flops straight back in to ruin things anew. This process has already begun with Resident Evil 7. The piles of DLC have already done a marvellous job at ruining all the base game's subtlety and mystique. It's like we had a lovely dildo that had a nice smooth glide action in our tender butthole, but for some reason they insisted on taping a Lego astronaut to the end. And I knew this would happen because it happened after Resident Evil 4 as well. And it occurred to me recently that for all my years of trumpeting Resident Evil 4, of wafting its delicious farts around like I'm making smoke signals, I've never done a full retro review of it. So as the summer drought crawls ever onwards, I thought I might as well do one, if only for cataloguing purposes. So here we go. Resident Evil 4 was very far from the fourth Resident Evil game. It was around the 9th or 10th, depending on what counts. The straightforward numbering of 1, 2, and 3 gave way to a sort of toxic soup of Code Veronicas, survivors, outbreaks, dead aims, until no one really knew what Resident Evil was, broadly speaking, just that it wasn't something you wanted close to your nose. The time for change had come. Away with tangled backstory. Unfix that camera from its lofty perch and let it breathe free as it hovers about our shoulder, demanding pets and bits of cream cracker. But this is misleading. Resident Evil Dead Aim was using a third-person chase camera and free aim shooting before Resident Evil 4 did, but Resident Evil 4 possessed the additional innovation of not being complete dog shit. You see, the series had a problem with shilly-shallying between its original methodical, claustrophobic tone and a more action-oriented focus, and Resident Evil 4 was the first to decisively shake off the scraps and turn the action dial all the way up. Right from the word go, you can tell things are going to be different. We're not starting the game in a spooky mansion or a ruined city at midnight or any other enclosed, foreboding environment. It's a nice bright day, and we're in a forest in Europe. Europe has about all the information we're given as to where we are, some mysterious remote region of Europe where they speak Mexican Spanish and still use pesetas as currency. But the point is, Resident Evil 4 is where the shilly-shallying ended. Ooh, I just can't decide, flounced the Resident Evil series. Am I about survival or action? Monsters or conspiracies? Am I serious or camp? Resident Evil 4 silenced the room by loudly slinging its knob onto the table. I don't know about you, but I'm about action, I'm about monsters, and by all the damned souls in hell, I'm camper than Dale Winton on a caravanning weekend. The story sees Leon S. Kennedy, protagonist of Resident Evil 2, but practically unrecognizable as a smirking secret agent who thinks ladders are for pussies, on a mission to rescue the president's daughter, him being the only dude bad enough, you see. His chosen method is to burst into a random house with his gun drawn and start jabbering questions at non-English speaking locals, so obviously he gets chased through the woods with scythes and pitchforks, but then it turns out they're all in an evil zombie death cult on top of being offended by Leon's people skills. Compare the quality of story and dialogue to any previous Resident Evil game and there isn't that much difference. It's all on a level somewhere around sci-fi original movie recreated for the school Christmas pageant, but with the slightest turn of the heel into self-awareness, Resident Evil 4 makes it work. Leon's dry bravado in the face of heads exploding into seafood platters, squeaky midget Napoleon, the merchant with the pirate voice who constantly talks like he's rubbing himself through his trouser pocket. It's all of that combined with the sheer sincerity of the voice acting. What Resident Evil 5 got wrong was forgetting that all the ingredients were essential. It had the terrible dialogue, it had the sincerity, but it didn't have midgets dressed like Napoleon. And yet, simultaneously, RE4 is still an unnerving horror game. There's this perception nowadays that horror has to be subtle, and that what you can't see is always scarier. A perception encouraged no small amount by me and my storybook marriage to Silent Hill 2. But if you're going for action horror, your best approach might be complete fucking relentlessness. RE4's combat is designed to hound you on all sides with angry European football hooligans until you can't back up any further because the big pile of poo that came out of your bum is getting in the way. It's not a constant barrage like your RE6 or your Dead Space, that's just mind-numbing. Downtime is used very effectively, but it can ramp up in a second. And like a well-written essay, this is summarized in the very first paragraph when you arrive at the village and have to fend off an endless horde of smelly foreigners for a fixed amount of time. Maybe you'll survive until the bell rings and watch nonplussed as the entire horde fucks off for pancakes, or maybe you'll meet the bloke who came to the costume party as a potato who instantly chainsaws your fucking head off. Either way, you'll have come to appreciate the way RE4 goes from 0 to 100 and back again in an instant like a bipolar dad on a long car journey. I don't think one can overstate the impact RE4 had. It was a landmark title in the history of third-person action games. Play it now and you'll note a few niggles, like the way you can't freely look around and the movement's a bit tanky, but the camera positioning will feel familiar if you've played basically any bloody third-person game that's come out lately, including God of War, despite hanging around on Kratos' shoulder being an excellent way to get a hip bone lodged in your eye socket. Even RE4's worst features, like those wonderful mid-cutscene QuickTime events that, as stimulating gameplay mechanics go, were right up there with a little sound on the children's storybook tape that tells you to turn the page, ended up sticking around too long for my liking, and in the ways it shook up the franchise, you can see some obvious parallels in the way RE7 did it. The cut back to basic rescue princess plot, the starting us off in a quiet forest and the sudden ramping from 0 to chainsaws, so you can understand why the RE2 remake makes me concerned about history running in cycles. Not only has a lone success primed Capcom Capcom to start pouring the old Resident Evil bullshit back in, it's going to be literally the exact same bullshit as before. You're going to remake 3 after this? Code Veronica? Dead Aim? Probably not that last one, if only because there isn't enough raw material in the septic tank. Battle Royale, the genre that is to video games what Chris Pratt is to movies these days. Very, very popular, absolutely bloody everywhere, but probably doesn't have a whole lot going on upstairs. It's a great genre for efficiently relearning how crap I am at first-person shooters no less than 40 times an hour, but when an obvious and simple idea takes off, imitators will swiftly follow. I mean, one big map and 100 randomly placed players is not exactly a Cecil B. DeMille production. So this week, I have been mostly playing Totally Accurate Battlegrounds, which is actually a hilarious parody of Battle Royale shooters. What it does is, instead of dropping 100 players onto a map full of randomly spawned equipment and gradually shrinking it until only one remains, it drops about 50 players onto a map full of randomly spawned equipment and gradually shrinks it until only one remains, and everyone's got googly eyes. Yeah, that's some astringent satire you've got going on there, Totally Accurate Battlegrounds. Truly the spirit of Jonathan Swift lives on through thee. Oh wait, what also makes it hilariously parodical is that everyone's at the mercy of a crazed physics engine that makes them wobble about like pipe cleaner figures on the floor of a moving vehicle with dodgy suspension. Did I mention it's by the cluster truck people? So players poing merrily across the landscape like overexcited puppies in the long grass and hold guns out in front of them the way that lady from Jurassic Park Trespasser did, although thankfully without the health meter tit. But Totally Accurate Battlegrounds falls into the not underpopulated trap of the attempted satire that ends up becoming a viable alternative to the thing it's satirizing, if not just another example of it. Classic Scream syndrome. The wobbly-bobbly physics mean that melee combat can actually overpower ranged weapons if you wobble-bobble your way up to a sniper as they pull the old Ramsay Bolton and continually miss your thrashing limbs until you get into range and knock all their teeth out with a loofah. On that note, there's also an extensive range of weapons, more weirdly extensive than satirically extensive. You've got guns, rocket launchers, crossbows, grenades, axes, sticks, and slightly sharper sticks, but no elastic band launchers or comedically oversized sex toys. The large range of guns also makes it hard to find more of the specific ammo that each one takes, thus improving the odds that a gunfight will eventually devolve into loofah dueling. The animation and uncluttered maps also makes it harder to hide or find cover, encouraging direct conflict, and I appreciate that the wall around the map is an actual literal wall, not a ring of fizzing Listerine. So all in all, we'll put TAB in the viable alternative category. It is a bit mired with bugs and cheaters, but they're diligently churning the patches out, which makes me wonder if any of the developers think that this has all gone a bit beyond a joke. Haha, let's make a Battle Royale mode of our silly physics game for April Fools. It's not like we'll have to support it for the rest of our fucking lives. It's like they served a trick rubber steak to their house guests and the idiots won't stop trying to eat the fucking thing. Hey, I can't chew this steak. Yes, haha, it's a rubber steak. April Fools, but I want to eat the steak. It smells of steak. Yes, we made it smell like steak because it needed to for the joke to work. I didn't expect you to get this into it. Ow, my stomach hurts after I ate the steak. Look, you weren't supposed to... just... fuck it, here's a real steak, alright? Have fun with it. Do I get a steak too? Can I have a slightly larger steak? Yes, fuck it, I'll cook steaks for everyone. This is my life now. That's all I had to say, really, is let's have an indie game chaser. How about Moonlighter, a roguelike pixel art dungeon crawler on Steam? Now, if you're anything like me, your eyes probably glazed over and you started thinking about sticky buns halfway through that description. A roguelike pixel art dungeon crawler indie game on Steam is like a seagull on a pier. Yes, you might have fun with it if it holds still long enough to let you take a funny picture, but there'll be another 12 along in a moment. And while Moonlighter, like many of its fellows, has some very well animated pixel art, a seagull wearing lipstick is still a seagull, just as likely to brazenly steal your cheeseburger. As much as there have been some very lovely roguelikes, I can't help feeling that we see them a lot because making randomly generated levels is slightly easier than meticulously designing a bunch of carefully curated maps with tiered challenges and story elements, and I think these days you have to do the Bloodborne thing, where random dungeons are there if you've got an hour to kill and are saving your higher brain functions for an upcoming speech or televised quiz show production, but it can't be the actual meat of the game anymore. To that end, Moonlighter is also a shop management game. Your job is to go into dungeons and collect a wide variety of vendor trash until your bag is full, then come home and load up your shelves. The interesting challenge then is figuring out how much to charge for the items with nothing to go on but a list of the items in descending order of value and whether the customers roll their eyes disgustedly at them or skip joyfully to the counter singing money makes the world go round. You then spend the money on upgrading your shop, the town, and your dungeon exploring gear because there's an old bloke who's constantly telling you not to try to reach the end of the dungeons and kill all the bosses, so obviously we're going to do that. I think the problems with Moonlighter emerge as soon as you have figured out most of the prices of the current dungeon's items. Once the deductive part is over, the game just turns into a slightly anemic roguelike dungeon crawler with an overly elaborate loot flogging system. The combat gets kind of rote. I gravitated to using a spear because it's no slower than any other weapon and had the advantage that all the dangerous stuff is going on at the far end of it. And besides that, your dodge roll has more iframes than a maritime museum has jolly interesting facts about knot tying. After 4 dungeon types and the final boss that rolled over like a frightened armadillo in a skate park, I was feeling rather underserved by Moonlighter. The shop management element is a nice enough idea, but just isn't fleshed out enough. More nuance might have been nice, like it mattering where you display what items, or whether or not you've solicited elicited an endorsement from Commander Shepard, I would have said it was an original idea, but then someone drew my attention to a Japanese game from 2010 named Racketeer, not to be confused with Racketeer, which is spelt Racketeer rather than Racketeer like the first Racketeer, which is a shop management come random dungeon crawler game with deeper haggling and salesmanship mechanics, which on the whole I recommend if you've got a higher than average tolerance for the animes. But I digress. The pieces only fell into place when Moonlighter's credits rolled and about 5,000 backers got name dropped. Ah yes, give me an O for overfunded Kickstarter project. I've learned to recognise the telltale signs of the overfunded Kickstarter project. They're like Californian teenagers, overly proud of themselves, unpunctual, and severely underweight. When all the great questions of the universe have been answered, why are we here, how do you open clamshell packaging without lacerating yourself, only one remains. Does a driving game need to have a plot? On the surface, maybe not, since it is still one of the more skill-oriented genres, at least until a game offers to do the handbrake turns for you if you pay it $5, and all you usually see of the player character is the back of their neck and an exhaust muffler. But then again, Driver San Francisco had a plot and did pretty well out of it. Fortunately, the Crew franchise has finally supplied the definitive answer to the question of does a driving game need a plot? The answer is yes, I mean no. I mean maybe a little bit. Thanks for your fucking contribution, Ubisoft. See, the Crew 1 had a plot. It was a surprisingly involved one, too, in which a bloke who looks a bit like the bastard offspring of Gordon Freeman and Phil Fish must avenge his brother's death and bring down a corrupt FBI agent by driving cars at things a lot. And that makes the rather conspicuous absence of a plot in The Crew 2 a cause for wonderment. Well, the plot is, you are a person who likes driving a lot, and your mission is to drive a lot. Also to become very popular on social media, a goal that can be best accomplished by driving a lot. Perhaps it's a sign of the times that the goal of getting a lot of social media followers is now considered equivalent to avenging a dead brother, that is, a universally understandable motivation. No, officer, I had to mount the pavement and plough through 2 Parisian-style street cafes. Don't you see that my Twitter profile depended on it? But I digress. The Crew 2, like The Crew 1, is a sandbox game by Ubisoft, a phrase still about as redundant as an unhealthy meal from McDonald's, that boasts a huge cohesive sandbox map of the entire continental United States and all of its important cities and St. Louis. The usual shrunk-down, heavily summarized Legoland version, obviously, but it'll still take you about an hour to drive from coast to coast. Not that you'd fucking want to. The map's got a shitload of dead space containing nothing but endless terrain and copy-pasted trees, and you'd probably have an equally enjoyable time playing an hour-long YouTube video compilation of inexpensive indie rock tracks where the singers all have their mouths way too close to an unfiltered microphone, while staring at the little position marker on the timeline and pretending you're riding on top of it. I'm pretty sure if you travelled in a straight line northeast by east from Los Angeles in this game, you wouldn't run into anything of note until you hit St. Louis, and arguably not even then. The game is divided between 4 distinct types of driving gameplay: pro racing, which involves driving to a place the fastest; off-road racing, which involves driving to a place the fastest; street racing, which involves driving to a place the fastest in a very irresponsible way; and freestyle, which involves doing stunts in a plane until you unlock the second tier, at which point it becomes about driving to a place the fastest. It's through these 4 extremely distinct disciplines we receive what amounts to the game's plot. Each of the 4 has a rival character who is currently the most accomplished racer, and someone assures us that this person is a bit of a twat and we should feel motivated to unseat them from their perch. And that's it. I don't even get a chance to gauge their twattishness for myself by interacting with them or taking them to the water slide park. I think some of the mystery voices that talk in your ear during races might have been the rival characters, but I don't know why you expect me to remember any of these doints when the game's context is as engaging as a slithering contest at a worm farm. Is it worth speculating why Ubisoft went from in-depth plot to basically none? Was it a calculated move because nobody gave shit one about the plot of the first Crew, or did Ubisoft use up all their budget and resources adding tits to one of Assassin's Creed Odyssey's protagonists? Whatever the case, a sequel having less stuff than the original is always a tough sell. It'd be like putting out a new smartphone without a headphone jack. More of a plot might have helped give the game some fucking structure. Yes, you unlock more races as you go, but the entire sandbox and fast travel are unlocked right from the start, so I don't feel like the game has anything new to reward you with as you progress. All it does is throw brightly coloured Christmas presents at you that contain new rims and suspensions that you can glue onto whatever vehicle you arbitrarily picked from the available list to make its numbers get slightly higher, and then you can attempt to convince yourself that it now handles better than it did before, even though I strongly suspect the unlockables have less effect than adding a fuzzy dice, and I wouldn't be surprised if the developers confess that once we've got them all tied to stakes. Oh, but I know what else they would say as I walked up with the burning torch. Sandbox, Yahtzee! Sandbox is not supposed to be structured, you make your own fun. Yeah, let's bring that up, Guy Fiery. Does anyone else remember a time when sandbox games were characterized as being cathartic, where the point was you could just go crazy if you were bored and the world would react appropriately, exploding cars and sending police after you, and that response was important because part of the glee in stealing cookies is knowing you'll get spanked to the moon and back if you're caught. You remember before Ubisoft turned sandboxes into glorified MMOs with the other players taken out and replaced with more grind. Bearing this in mind, The Crew 2 has one of the least reactive sandbox worlds I've ever seen. The street racing lads occasionally mention that they have trouble with the cops, selfishly not wanting people to plough through pedestrian precincts with flamethrowers attached to their rear bumpers, but cops don't come after you in game. I'm pretty sure every NPC vehicle has exactly the same mass. I know because I sideswiped a bus and it reacted like a bamboo frame with aluminium foil wrapped around it. There's also no damage physics, unless you count fences and Parisian street cafes atomizing the instant you lightly brush past. Although now I'm mentioning it, there's very little distinction between what you can plough through and what flimsy wooden park benches will cause you to instantly go from 200 to 0 in a way that by rights should have decapitated you with your own seatbelt. But there's no car damage, so after a head-on collision that should by rights have reduced both cars to bleeding cardboard cutouts, the game just pulls the old Prince of Persia that didn't happen and drops you back on the road a few yards back. And I am 1,000,000% certain that this is because the Crew 2's vehicles and environments are all licensed from real-world companies and slathered with corporate logos, and licensors are notoriously iffy about their products being shown getting so much as a dent, to say nothing of getting wrapped around an orphanage. So all the cars just roll indestructibly about the landscape like Maltesers on a loved one's lower back. I suppose in the dilemma between more fun stroke realism or more money, Ubisoft opting to bend over and spread its hot pink wallet open shouldn't come as a surprise. If you just want a multi-terrain racer, then there's one in here, sure enough, but you might wonder why it's spread out across a pointlessly large, empty, uninteresting sandbox. If you want that experience, then just play, say, Mario Kart with your accelerate and brake buttons on opposite sides of the room. Octopath is sadly not what Chris Eubank calls his favourite kind of marine life. It just means 8 paths. Octopath Traveler is a game about going through the stories, or travelling the paths if you will, of 8 characters. Might seem a bit on the nose as titles go, but then it is a Japanese game, probably sounds cooler in a foreign language. Yes, it actually literally means 8 paths in English. Gosh, you're so clever and worldly, Square Enix-san. It's like how any food sounds classier if you give it a French name. Merde de chien à la gravier probably sounds a lot more palatable than dog turds in gravel. Anyway, Octopath Traveler is a JRPG, but don't hold that against it, because it's deliberately trying to evoke an older era of JRPGs when they were more tolerable, and weren't all over-designed bogwash and prolonged fashion parades on the planet of melodramatic, emotionally stunted shitheads. Actually, thinking about it, that's been less the case with JRPGs lately, possibly because we haven't had a new Final Fantasy in a while, and the last one we did have was about people going around relatively soberly dressed. But while we're on the subject, it's games like Final Fantasy VI that Octoplut Unraveler is most trying to ape, the seminal 16-bit Final Fantasy that hit the perfect sweet spot between the series beginning to indulge more complex plots in less standard fantasy settings, and everything turning into convoluted magitechno-visual diarrhea, and whatever the fuck was going on with Final Fantasy X. At least everything was visually consistent in 2D times, nice readable tile-based environments, and every character a super deformed big head lad with exactly the same face, so they all look like chronically overdressed lemmings. That's the visual style Octopus Rattler is going for, although the little 2D character sprites are all running around fully 3D environments with pixely 16-bit textures stretched over them, all rendered in accordance with graphical standards of the modern age, meaning everything is lit like an overexposed photo and slightly brown. So here comes my challenge, viewers. In order to gauge the effectiveness of the game's story, I'm now going to attempt to list all 8 characters and their story arcs from memory alone. There's Tressa, an underage girl who vows with the lofty ambition of youth to dedicate her life to becoming a really good travelling merchant, this being a more innocent time before child protection services. Then there's Cyrus, a teacher who gets fired because of some Mean Girls drama and goes looking for an overdue library book or something. Primrose, she's a stripper assassin who shows her commitment to revenge by refusing to put trousers on regardless of the weather. This might be easier if I tried to remember their classes rather than their personalities. So there's standard warrior man with sword, who is seeking justice on the man who robbed him of honour because aren't they fucking always. The thief, Therion, I remember his name because it contains most of the letters of thief, and his story involves having to steal some things because if you've only got one thing going for you, might as well own it, I say. Priest, yep, got one of them. Some blonde lady going on a pilgrimage because the lady who was supposed to do it called in sick or something. How many is that? 6. Shit. Oh yeah, there's the hunter lady looking for her missing master who comes from the village where everyone talks like they got really drunk at a Renaissance fair and decided they were just going to have fun with it. Lastly, apothecary lad. Their friend gets poisoned, they cure the poison, then they decide to travel the world because the format demands it. Well, I suppose we can't all be stripper assassins. Not all stories are created equal, so it's weird that while you can freely swap out 3 members of your 4-man party, whoever you picked first leads the party permanently. So don't pick apothecary lad first, as you'll be stuck with him like a piece of toilet paper trailing from your shoe. What I find iffy about the whole presentation is that I really get a sense that my ragtag bunch of anime misfits are actually interacting with each other. For the first part of the game, you tour all the home villages randomly touching people until one goes, "Hello, random group of strangers. I'm about to embark on a very personal quest that will define the rest of my life. Why not tag along?" And that's your new party member, smilingly joining up with a group of what might be cannibalistic serial tax dodgers for all they know, accepting that they're going to have to mutely witness the personal bullshit of 7 complete strangers before they come back around to sorting out whatever put a hair up their own arse. It's particularly jarring with characters like Primrose doing the "I am dishonoured and alone and have nothing left in this world but my quest for violent, bloody revenge" bit, never acknowledging the 7 colourful dudes at varying stages of adolescence with whom she shares a sleeping bag every night. It's only right at the end of the game that any connection between the 8 stories is established. Before that, it's 8 separate stories rather than a story about 8 people. Every time you go through a new chapter of one party member's story, everyone else just disappears up their butthole for the duration of the cutscene. Sometimes after a cutscene, a little button prompt comes up, and you can teleport the relevant character and one other party member to the interaction dimension where they discuss what just happened. But I don't see why they couldn't have worked that into the scene. Made it look like some actual organic relationship building was going on, not just a spot of post-match commentary like Statler and fucking Waldorf. The structure of Octagon Waffler's gameplay, meanwhile, is kind of formulaic. Every chapter goes through the same motions. You pursue whatever villain episode is through a little maze of random combat encounters, confront them at the end, and they turn into 20-foot realistically drawn version of themselves, and you fight them for absolutely bloody ages. As for the combat, it's fine, I guess. You take it in turns to twat each other, which is to my mind essential for turn-based combat. There's also this whole system based around figuring out enemy weaknesses to knock out their defenses, and saving up our glowing power testicles so we can scrunch them all up at once to do an extra damaging attack. But I think Square Enix are indulging the modern JRPG tendency to overthink things. I mean, I liked how the combat in Final Fantasy VI was straightforward and didn't get in the way much. Enemies attack, twat twat twat, enemies go away. The universe uncrosses its legs. Here, even the random battles drag on a bit, and not the fun kind of drag on. All in all, I would classify Otacon Breveler as a time killer. It doesn't trouble my story-liking brain or tickle my gameplay gonads much, and too much of it is rampant cliché and grind, which is funnily enough the name of my usual law firm. After the first round of story chapters, I was about 6 below the recommended level for the next one, and thus did things get grindy. Once I'd fucking found somewhere to grind, of course, considering the game map refuses to tell you what level each area is suitable for. In retrospect, maybe I shouldn't have equipped that passive perk Cyrus had that reduced the number of random encounters. But it was his only perk at the time, and it took ages to learn, so what was I supposed to do? Not equip it? That's like giving me a long cylindrical object and telling me not to stick it up me dog's bum. Every year it's the bloody same. Oh, the mid-year drought isn't so bad, I'll just do indie games on Steam and retros and laugh at an industry that never learns anything, tee-hee-hee. And now we're in the middle of it, and I'm desperately searching under sun-bleached rocks looking for something that isn't slathered in anime faces like a row of electrical sockets. You know, I even seriously considered reviewing No Man's Sky again. Now it's apparently been patched all the way from universally despised pariah to the lofty heights of another bloody survival crafting exploration game. But no, it's against my principles to encourage this let's just fix it in post culture. That is not a world in which I wish to exist, because I would never be able to have confidence in a negative review again. A game could melt my PC into hot slag until it falls over and sets fire to the curtains. I'd still have to add the proviso, oh, but it's alright because in the future they might patch in a new pair of curtains. So fuck it. In the end, I decided to review a game I missed out on from last year that popped up on my Steam recommendations apropos of nothing, like a starry-eyed young actor showing up on the last day of auditions. Observer is a game by Bloober Team. No, really, that's their name. Sounds to me like someone asked them their name before they'd come up with it, and someone had to hastily make one up. Same developers as Layers of Fear, which you may recall I didn't take too much because it was a classic walking simulator with all the usual walking simulator trappings, deliberately obscure plot, and it's only the continued brain-busting challenge of locating the W key on your keyboard that stops it being essentially the same as riding the Haunted Mansion ride at Disneyland. Observer, in contrast, plays like a first-person adventure game that's currently in rehab for walking simulator addiction. It's gradually rebuilding its life, one dialogue tree or basic lock-opening puzzle at a time, but every now and again it falls off the wagon. And if Layers of Fear came of riding the Haunted Mansion ride a few too many times, Observer comes of rewatching Blade Runner every night. Cyberpunk dystopia, check. You know, just for once I'd like to see a cyberpunk utopia where the corporation started bolting computers to people's faces and everything just worked out perfectly well. Main character's a detective, check. Completely unnecessary opening text crawl, which might as well have been replaced with the words, it is a cyberpunk dystopia, check. Rutger Hauer's in it, double check with chips on the side. Rutger Hauer, who now talks like he's processing all his words through a slightly blunt hand-cranked ice-crushing machine, is an observer, a sort of cyber detective with the ability to jack into other people's brains in order to search their memories for evidence of dirty crimes and whatever else should be of interest. Perhaps jack off was right after all. Anyway, our hero, Daniel Lazarski, which is one of those surnames that sounds just perfect being described as a loose cannon across the desk of a sweaty police chief, is contacted by his estranged tech genius son, who probably stopped calling because he was sick of explaining to Rutger Hauer how to use Facebook. But something's gone to shit and he needs help, so dear old dad comes to the slum apartment building his son was calling from, finds a whole bunch of crime scenes and dead bodies, and must piece together exactly what his son was doing and what it has to do with the evil megacorporation that inevitably hangs over everything like the highly productive rectum of a pitiless controller god by jacking into the minds of a select number of victims. So basically it's Blade Runner meets Psychonauts meets the Haunted Mansion ride. You know, detective games have long struggled with the concept of investigative gameplay. How do you make a gameplay mechanic based around the player figuring stuff out that can determine that the player actually did figure it out and isn't just rolling a belt sander back and forth across the controller until progress happens? Observer takes a bold approach to this age-old problem, and that's to not let it bother them in the slightest. While you go over crime scenes with 3 different pairs of magic electronic spectacles holding down the analyze button on anything that makes one of your spectacles go widdly-wee, what usually happens after you've widdly-weed everything that can be widdly-weed is that Rutger Hauer announces he's figured it out and the door to the next bit opens. Either that or there'll be a 4-digit code lock you need to figure out, but the game makes sure no one gets left behind. There is literally a moment where the numbers you need to figure out materialize before you in giant neon digits. Another time I was casually jacking off into the head of a dead young lady in a room with a conspicuous 4-digit code lock, and towards the end of the jack-off sequence I see the same lady in the same room going 6105, 6105, 6105. So once I was back in reality, I went back to the code lock flushed with pride at my deductive reasoning skills. But before I could do anything, Rutger Hauer went, I think the code might be 6105. What do you think, electronic geniuses of the future? So despite its handful of puzzles and explorative element where you wander the maze-like hallways of the apartment building having arguments with random people's door store intercoms in a way that screams, we didn't want to have to design more than like 3 characters, Observer is still elbow deep in Walking Simulator land. The jack-off sequences are the moments when the Walking Simulator leaps off the bench, rubbing its hands together with glee, and I'm tempted to use the word overindulgent, as well as the word cunt blast, but that's for unrelated reasons. So with the justification that we're exploring a dying person's mental realm stitched together from unreliable memories, all the old layers of fear reality buggeration comes back in force. Spooky happenings and illogical geography galore, but again, it's just Haunted Mansion press forward to continue, and I keep hearing random audio stings because apparently something sudden and jump scary happened while I was looking at something else. But then, on like 3 occasions during jack-off bits, Mr. Gameplay wakes up with a start, sees that Mr. Walking Simulator has been running unchecked for like an hour, and goes, shit, here's a monster, stealth around it or something, I guess. But I've been settling into a light puzzling come sightseeing tour groove for the last several hours, so this sudden risk of insta-kill game over is very bloody jarring. If you wanted to sprinkle gameplay into your Haunted Mansion ride, then I'd have put some kind of comprehension test at the end, to see if we'd figured out that the exploding jackdaw with the head of Bruce Forsyth was supposed to symbolise that the subject didn't get on with their dad growing up. But in summary, I'd say I like Observer quite a bit more than Layers of Fear, and it's mainly because, fun as it may be to explore the visual artistry of the interactive medium by throwing plates at our head as we walk down a hallway, a nice bit of context and grounding in reality can work wonders, and the little puzzle or gameplay challenge can really help us refocus when we've been dazed by a flying sugar bowl. It's just finding the right blend of elements now. Exploration mechanics, yes. Jarring insta-kill monster interludes, cunt blast. Yep, it's still drought season in both gaming and California. Sorry to keep mentioning it, but you might need context if you're watching this video on the 16th of Funvember or something. So in lieu of having saved up enough morphine tablets, here are 2 more indie games on Steam, and I'll even think of a connection between them if you give me a mo. They're both about some kind of peacekeeping official having to rescue some things and murder some other things. Oh fuck it, let's just go with they both bored the tits off me. Let's start with Chasm. It's pixel art, it's procedural, it's Metroidvania, and of course it's fucking kickstarted. Hey Kickstarter backers, don't insulate the inside of that comfort zone too much, there'll be no room for your fat spotty arse. We are a rookie knight dispatched to an abandoned mining town to figure out what's gone wrong, and upon taking a look in the mine, he goes, well, there's your problem, you've got a Metroidvania game down there. 5 distinct zones opened up in stages by new abilities, boss fights, more backtracking than a mistakenly laid out railway. That's Metroidvania, alright. Hope you've been maintaining that save point in your town square, because this is gonna cost you, madam. Castlevania seems like the main influence. Rescuing individual villagers is straight out of Order of Ecclesia, and there's a friendly animate sword NPC you can get that made the 60% of my brain devoted to remembering things from Symphony of the Night light up like Blackpool Pier. But while Alucard could reasonably be expected to take on Dracula's minions because he ate asses for breakfast, the spotty gimp we control here doesn't inspire the same confidence, and the only thing that's changed by the time we fight the formless unstoppable demon king of the underworld at the end is that he found a nicer sword and some running shoes. Also, Chasm is procedurally generated, or at least that's the claim. It seems like the boss fights, the warp rooms and the upgrades are all roughly in fixed order, and it's just all the filler rooms in between that change, but I'm not even 100% on that. I started a second game with a new seed to see if I could figure out what had changed, and discovered a short ways in that I didn't actually give a shit. Mind you, Castlevania and randomization has a precedent. I've played Aria of Sorrow so many times, I've tried using fan-made ROM randomizers to swap all the pickups around and inject a little variety into my next playthrough, but what usually ended up happening was that a starting skeleton would drop the fucking clave soulish or something, and I'd spend the rest of the game effortlessly handing out wedgies. Maybe that's why Chasm's gameplay challenge seems painfully unbalanced, but I think it was mainly because of the magic daggers. See, magic attacks are upgradable, and you can equip whichever one you want, and once fully upgraded, the magic daggers were doing between 60 and shitloads of damage a pop, and still only cost 1 point to use. So I ended up spamming them like it was fucking Gradius, and killed every single boss in the game's second half on my first go, often without getting hit. I did at least finish the game, but only because it took basically no effort, and I had some podcasts to listen to, and while procedural generation theoretically adds replay value, I'd far rather replay a game that carefully crafts its layout for maximum entertainment than a game like Chasm, which rearranges its dull, generic hallways full of repeated enemies in a way that has all the practical impact of rearranging the contents of a bag of frozen oven chips. I can state that Chasm is the very best game I've played named Chasm. It is at least better than Chasm the Rift, because in contrast it's a generic Castlevania ripoff with some nice pixel art rather than a generic Quake ripoff with the colour spectrum of a turd convention. So let's move on to our second game, which I didn't actually finish, but I'm going to offer a definitive opinion on anyway, because I'm a busy man with a lot of uneaten crisps in the house. This is The Police 2. I haven't played This Is the Police 1, so I had no idea what I was in for, but I was drawn to the fact that the acronym was TITPA. This Is the Police 2, it turns out, is a game structured somewhat like XCOM, with isometric turn-based cover combat missions interspersed with a management game where you equip and dispatch named officers to deal with situations as they come up, all of whom are referred to by male pronouns, even the ones that are obviously women, which is either abject laziness or a relevant indictment of small-town authorities. Because the plot is about an inexperienced female deputy in a small-town department having to take over when the sheriff is killed and who just can't seem to get respect in a man's world. Fortunately, her officers arrest a drifter who turns out to be a former police chief wanted on federal corruption charges, but more importantly, he's a man with a big manly beard, so she puts him in charge instead. Hey, This Is the Police 2. Did you see what I did there? I got the premise of your story across in about half a paragraph. Perhaps you could show that to your cutscene writer the next time you get a word in edgeways. Yes, TITPA has pretensions to cinematic storytelling, but, well, here's my impression of a This Is the Police 2 cutscene. I mean, this is me doing an impression of a This Is the Police 2 cutscene right now. I'm doing it now. Can't you see I'm doing an impression of a This Is is the Police 2 cutscene, viewers. Viewers, are you listening, viewers? You need to be listening to understand my impression of a This is the Police 2 cutscene. I think they're going for an ultra-naturalistic dialogue style, but if realism was the intent, it fell flat, because realistically, if I was stuck in a conversation like this, I'd stick my head in the nearest bread slicing machine. Imagine they remade Fargo, but every scene was extended by the 10 minutes before the relevant thing happens and the 10 minutes after it as well. It's particularly cruel because the first thing you do is a tutorial for the turn-based XCOM style combat, and then approximately 94 billion years elapse before you get to do it for real. And not just because the cutscenes are all like an argument broke out at the old folks' home between the hearing loss wing and the Alzheimer's ward. Turns out the bulk of the gameplay is dispatching officers to petty crimes and making snap FTL-style text-based decisions. Which isn't unenjoyable, but it is a bit of a lurch when the combat does come back and we go to a pitched battle with armed bank robbers immediately after solving the case of the schoolboys supergluing their bum cheeks to a bus shelter. But that's everyday police work for you, I guess, and after the first combat mission I was feeling positive. I stealthily brought all the baddies in alive with my XCOM chops. But when I was picking my dudes for the second combat mission, the game went, oh, by the way, some of these officers hate you, and also being alive, so they're not going to do anything you tell them to do. Oh, could you point out in some obvious way which officers have this characteristic? No, now assemble your team. Sure enough, I inadvertently picked one of these loose cannon dudes who immediately ran off, shot the first bad guy they saw, and caused the nearby building to disgorge about 20 gang members like a drug-fueled clown car, and all my dudes got dead. And that's when I decided I'd had enough of tit per two. It's one thing to bore my tits off, it's quite another to then kick my tits around the garden with a gameplay system I'd usually kinda enjoy. Feels like a betrayal, like getting cut off in traffic by a character from Sesame Street. Alright, I put up with this drought nonsense for long enough, games industry. Put something new out or I'm kicking this chair away right now. Alright, here's We Happy Few. It's a procedurally generated... Wait, stay on the chair. It's also got a retro-futurist aesthetic. Oh, well, man the fucking spunk pumps. Everything's retro-futurist these days. Bioshock was a wonderful thing to bring into the world, but the retro-futurist trend is just getting silly now. Did you all decide you were sick of hiring concept artists? So you went to your grandma's basement and nicked an armful of ideal home catalogues from the 70s? But seriously though, We Happy Few does interest me. I know it's been on early access for what is technically known as a yonk, but it seemed like it was going to have some kind of story, and I didn't want to spoil that for myself while it was still at the puppet theatre stage of development. But what also interested me as a British person was that it's an extremely British game set in Britain, where British characters do British things, and wait a minute, what's that Canadian flag doing sticking out of your tit-shaped police helmet? Oh right, forgive me, it's actually a Canadian game setting out to be a love letter to retro British culture, so you know what that means, everyone. Strap in for a bunch of fucking Monty Python references. But let's be fair, We Happy Few is set in an alternative 60s Britain inspired by the weirdly specific and no less weirdly well-populated genre of retro British dystopian fiction as seen in 1984, Brave New World, A Clockwork Orange, The Prisoner, V for Vendetta, and every panty-sloshing wet dream Margaret Thatcher ever had. And there is actually some very apt and intelligent satire of the British national identity going on here, as well as a load of NPCs with funny accents quoting Monty bleeding Python at each other. In a world where Britain lost the Second World War, the people of the isolated city of Wellington Wells are kept distracted from the nightmares of past and present reality with a designer drug that induces happiness, suppresses negative memories, prevents childbirth, and pairs well with onion gravy. Blimey, talk about science fiction, my antidepressants didn't do much more than kill all my boners. Everyone who can't or won't take the drug gets exiled to a big meadow immediately outside of town, which is pretty fucking weak sauce as far as exile goes, but I suppose that's what happens when everyone in authority is off their fucking tits all day. This is that apt satire thing I was talking about, because what this is the British characteristic of keeping a cheerful, stiff upper lip in times of crisis elevated to oppressive fascist doctrine. It's a theme that also comes up in the characterization of the protagonist, Arthur Hastings, who seems to descend into fits of stammering anxiety at the mere thought of causing a fuss, and apologizes profusely every time he has to kill someone or cuddle them to sleep. And that's the quintessence of the Britain I remember. The oppressive fascist state doesn't come about because of internal strife or military coup. It comes about largely because nobody wanted to cause a fuss. Arthur stops taking his pills when he starts remembering his long-lost brother, and thus begins a picaresque narrative in which we explore the various workings of Wellington Wells in pursuit of Arthur's quest to escape it, the game being structured in true Bioshock style, wherein every deceptively simple objective has about 500 hidden sub-objectives, so you'll get the chance to run errands through all four corners of the earth, and you can't take a more direct path because that would entail causing a fuss. So We Happy Few could be considered an acid test of sorts for procedural generation. Yes, we've all seen how proc gen is very useful in indie dungeon crawlers for creating theoretically infinite levels, as long as you're fine with having a theoretically infinite number of rather hauntingly similar levels. But if you're making a AAA style immersive sim in your Bioshock or Prey or Deus Ex kind of mold, is it viable to procedurally generate the hub world if you don't have the manpower to design one manually because everyone's too busy printing t-shirts for the Kickstarter backers? And the answer to that is no, you big twats. Enticing as it may be to add a game designer to the list of jobs the corporate overlords no longer have to pay someone to do, a computer can't design a fun game unless a human tells it what a fun game is. And at that point, the human is being what we call a game designer. So We Happy Few has its important fixed spots and story locations, and in between them is a load of procedurally generated bugger all. A quest places an objective marker about 1 kilometre away, I hike over to the marker, nothing happens in the meantime. I skipped through a meadow and picked a few flowers. Oh, the hard-boiled life of the defiant revolutionary subversive. I've just had this really crazy idea, guys. How about, instead of procedurally generating an open world, because every game has to have one and you need to keep up, you just restrict the gameplay to the important fun parts and cut out the travel time in between. We could call them I don't know, stages, or levels, or chapters if you're pretentious. That way there wouldn't be as much useless, boring bullshit. Blimey, why has no one thought of this? But even if you enjoy running across empty meadows because you're a fucking horse, the proc gen might also be why the game's buggier than a Jungle Explorer's sock drawer. It was almost certainly the reason I could turn a corner and find about 50 clones of the same old lady standing around a section of road having a Monty Python quote off. Mind you, I doubt it was the procedural level design that was making half of them float 2 feet off the ground and the other half clip inside a wall. I know I hate to cause a fuss, but recoiling through a wall while I'm trying to beat you to death with a cricket bat isn't just rude, it's downright unsporting. What were 2 years of development in early access for if not fixing the fucking bugs? Giving each other piggyback rides to the Doctor Who marathons? But all the bug spray in the world won't fix the fact that it's not a very well designed game. Having to weigh taking a happy drug to go unnoticed against the risk of overdosing is a solid enough mechanic, but in practice you don't need to take happy drugs much at all. Most of the happy drug detecting barriers can be bypassed and people don't notice you as long as you dress right and avoid jumping onto cars while hooting like a gibbon. But even if you do cause the dreaded fuss and the NPCs all close in drawing their frying pans and sticks with copies of Wisdom nailed to the end, you can run faster than the world's sexiest greyhound through a furry convention and are surrounded by miles of procedurally generated wilderness full of hiding spots. Yes, your protagonist has Horizon Zero Dawn syndrome and can only hide in one specific kind of bush, but I still ended up uninterestedly sprinting through all the areas straight to the objectives because I knew all I had to do afterwards was stand behind a moderately large cat and all the guards and security devices would forget about my existence entirely. In brief, We Crappy Poo is a game with good ideas buried under piles of rubbish for the sake of openness. Don't get me wrong, openness is good if one happens to be a cake shop or a pair of legs, just not so much if you're a tiger cage or Margaret Thatcher's legs. I had very specific desires in mind this week as I perused the new indie games like a Catholic priest moonlighting as a crosswalk attendant. I decided I was undergoing trial separation with anything that could be remotely described as open world or procedural. It's not that open world games and I don't both love you anymore, viewers. They can still take you out at the weekend to hunt through the bins for crafting materials, but I have needs that I have to fulfill elsewhere. I'm going to play a nice linear crafted story that makes me feel clever, not like an unusually well-scrubbed homeless person who can leak rubber cement from their armpits, nor indeed like someone strapped to a conveyor belt drawing inexorably into the world's most boring doomsday machine, so that's most walking simulators out. No, I'm going to play a 2D point-and-click adventure game. Take myself back to a simpler time when if there was an object you need in a high place, you couldn't just exploit the physics engine. You'd have to combine a toasting fork with an extension cord and a stickle brick and click on something 2 pixels wide because trying anything else will make the game obstinately fold its arms and call you a stupid prick. Unavowed is an urban fantasy game that the Steam user tags seem to think is an RPG, possibly because someone was having a stroke. It's only an RPG in the sense that the game itself is playing the role of a 2D point-and-click adventure game. It was developed in something called Adventure Game Studio. There's a little giveaway for the sharp-eyed expert. You play an average dork or dorkette. You choose your gender at the start, which just goes to show how far behind Assassin's Creed really is. What? Oh, yes, I suppose getting to pick your gender is technically role-playing, but then again, avocado is technically a fruit, but you wouldn't put it in a fucking crumble. Anyway, you are some flavour of bland pleb with one of 3 bland backstories who gets possessed by a demon and goes on the rampage before they get exorcised by the Unavowed, a secret society of paranormal detectives pledged to fight evil. Gotta say, guys, that sounds pretty fucking avowed to me. Probably more avowed than most people. Also, it's rather a grand name for 3 dudes who share a flat, consisting of a genie, a half-genie lady with a big bum, and a bloke who does fire magic in a trench coat and a big hat, and an enormous sandwich board with the phrase, "We've read a few Dresden Files books" daubed across it. Anyway, now that the demon has put your bland pleb face atop the most wanted list, you have no choice but to join the Unavowed. You've got no supernatural abilities, or indeed any perceivable qualifications besides a very bland face, but I guess the washing up isn't going to do itself. It transpires that none of your new colleagues can so much as run a D&D campaign, so it falls to you to take the lead, recruit some new talents, and undo all the piss artistry your demonically possessed self imposed upon the city of New York. Now, if you have read a Dresden Files book, then you have my sympathies. Don't give up, there is always help out there. But if you have, then the world of Unavowed will seem very familiar. It's your fairly bog-standard urban fantasy. Magical races have lived in hiding among us for centuries and must be pretty fucking shit at it because literally every bookshop in the world has an entire section devoted to stories about them, bollocks. So it's a modern-day city full of demons and wizards and fairies and clumsy analogies to contemporary race relations. And as such, Unavowed is a touch derivative theme-wise, but I think that's forgivable as long as it's serving up an engaging enough little yarn. Having said that, I'm not sure if that's thanks to or in spite of the usual adventure game trappings. Some of you may know that I have some history with the adventure game studio community from way back. Basically, I hung around until they stopped feeding me like a feral cat, but also because I felt adventure games were too limited, and so was Adventure Game Studio, more to the point. You can have the loveliest art in the world, and Unavowed does have some lovely backgrounds, but there's always something dodgy about how the animations integrate. It doesn't help that every character in Unavowed spends 90% of their time standing like they're waiting for a bus on the street, waiting for a bus in the ethereal realm, waiting for a bus in the back of a speeding boat during a tense pursuit with a sea monster. Every character also has one action pose that they occasionally slide in and out of as naturally as an articulated sex toy, switching modes from sensitive to violent buggery. The broader problem with adventure games is that the challenge is having to navigate your way along one specific thread of logic. If it's too obscure, like you can only prod the angry octopus with the garden hoe and not the souvenir miniature of Nelson's column, then it gets annoying. But if it's too obvious, like the only things you can interact with are a fat dog and a hole shaped like a fat dog, then it gets boring. You've got to walk a fine line between solutions making sense but being obscure enough that you feel clever for figuring them out. Unavowed is more on the fat dog side of things. You only ever have access to small numbers of rooms, and half the time you can progress just by exhausting dialogue with everyone. I did feel clever figuring some things out. There's a bit with a duel where you have to find the loophole in the rules that springs to mind, but for the most part I rampaged through the chapters barely slowing down. Part of that might be because you can choose which two helpers to bring along each chapter, and so the puzzles have to be laid out in such a way that any combination of characters can solve them, which reflects thoughtful design and is all very impressive, but it's impressive in the way that plate spinning is impressive. Yes, very skillful, but I'm going to want that plate back soon so I can finish eating my dinner off it. See, when you're asked to pick characters, you don't have any idea what the chapter's going to be about or whose skills or experiences are most appropriate, so your choice is always going to be completely arbitrary. And unless you really do want to start a boys-only treehouse club, I'm not convinced it's worth it. But I'll get back to the story because I do like the game and I only want to piss on its shoes, not right down the back of its neck. It's about as deep a story as you'll get in an AGS game. Despite the limited locations, it succeeds in creating a sense of a much bigger world, largely by letting our imagination fill in the blanks. Bear that in mind, we happy few. Bear that in mind, Vampire, and every other game that tried to fully create a big world and ends up being about as fun and involving as pulling your trousers around your ankles and filling them with half a ton of wet sand. And while the Dresden Files style Wizards in New York malarkey is basically the equivalent of Harlequin romance novels for lonely men in their 20s, I liked the characters. They all had rounded backstories doled out both through implication and, yes, admittedly dialogue trees, but parceled effectively across multiple between-chapter downtime bits that don't vomit their GCSE results at you the first time you seem remotely interested. And despite a few glaring holes, the plot had some interesting twists and in the end I was engaged. And that's all you can ask for, really. Well, it's not all. I could ask for a hand job, but I'm pretty sure you didn't bring the cream or the Long John Silver costume. Since it's important to me that my indie game double bills have some kind of theme in case Zero Punctuation ever gets adapted into a stage musical, I guess this week we're going for games that are quite a bit like another game but not as good. We'll get Ben Elton to write the song for it to add some kind of hilariously satirical parallel. So let's start with Guacamelee 2, a game that's quite a bit like Guacamelee 1, but not as good. Guacamelee is the non-unionized Mexican labor force of Metroidvania, inexpensive, hardworking, perfectly decent, probably getting deported anyway. I guess it's Mexican in the same sense that We Happy Few was British. They got someone who'd never been to Mexico but has watched an awful lot of television to write down everything Mexico related they could think of and made a game about that. So it's about lucha libre wrestlers, sombreros, cacti, piñatas, moustaches, chickens, and a seemingly endless supply of limited run soap operas about people getting married. The protagonist of Guacamelee 1, who's named Juan, because of course he is living happily with his wife and family when a new threat appears, one that's markedly reminiscent of the previous one. And our hero must explore a Metroidvania world markedly reminiscent of the last game's one in order to bring things to a markedly reminiscent satisfactory conclusion. I never did Guacamelee 1, did I? I forget why. Maybe a Call of Duty game came out that week and I considered it more important that everyone notice all the subtextual racism in it. Well, that's a shame, because for the record, Guacamelee's quite good. A standout in the somewhat overpopulated Border Patrol child detention centre that is the indie Metroidvania genre, because it manages the rare thing of becoming more challenging the more abilities you unlock for an appropriate difficulty curve that starts with blandly hopping onto platforms like a stupid frog trying to escape from its own bum, and ends with these insane wall run, wall jump, uppercut, double jump grapple sequences where you have to make use of the propulsive power of your every last fart. And by integrating movement and fighting abilities, the platforming and the combat evolve in parallel and both end up being damn impressive to watch as long as you remember to put on your most skillful trousers. And I guess my problem with Guacamelee 2 is that it's just pointing at Guacamelee 1 and going, yeah, basically that. I suppose it is 4-player now, but that's about as relevant to me as it coming free with a pair of donkey castrating scissors. Being more of Guacamelee 1 is only as big a problem as you make it, but everything feels a little more half-hearted. Even the final boss fight just sort of comes and goes like a needlessly loud advert in the middle of a YouTube video. It doesn't help that Guacamelee seems to think it has a sense of humour, in the same sense that the 7-Eleven seems to think that its coffee is fit for human consumption. It's mainly memes and excruciatingly chummy references to other games, and it's got that Disney Star Wars problem, where every dialogue has to end on a gag no matter how dramatic the context, lest anyone think for a nanosecond that we're too weighty and serious to be licensed for Happy Meal toys. So when a nun with a guitar tells us the tragic backstory of the main villain, at the end she has to pick up her guitar again and say, anyway, here's Wonderwall. Wait, that's not a gag, that's barely a sentence. Oh, don't stress it, Grandad, you're probably at that age where meme culture's starting to leave you behind. Piss off, viewer. I can't be old, I swear about video games on the internet for a living. If I were a chicken, I'd still have half the eggshell on my face, making snarky videos about amniotic fluid. But on that note, let's move on from the highly overpopulated genre of indie Metroidvanias to the severely underpopulated genre of paperwork checking simulators, which contains only 2 games. Papers, Please, and now this one. Oh yes, and Tom Clancy's The Division. But that one only because it was so boring it made me stop and do my tax return instead. The game is Not Tonight, which isn't the best title, because in the time it took to go from buying the game to looking looking for it on my Steam list, I completely forgot what it was called. It's set in Britain, but in contrast to We Happy Few, is pretty clearly made by British people, because it's less tea and Monty Python quotes and more black comedy and pregnant teenagers with bad haircuts. In an alternative post-Brexit 2018, an extreme isolationist party has taken power and pledged to enforce national purity. And as a second-generation immigrant, you now have to work as a bouncer to avoid being deported to Europe. And occasionally you have to check visas at the border just to abandon whatever pretense remained that this wasn't a Papers, Please knockoff. I hesitate to say Papers, Please knockoff in case paperwork checking is the hot new genre, and I'll feel as stupid as I do about when we used to call FPS's Doom clones, but Not Tonight is deliberately doing its hair exactly like Papers, Please and illicitly trying to get off with Papers, Please's boyfriend. It starts off simple with you just checking expiry dates on IDs, and as the government gets more paranoid, complexity increases until you're checking off 2 forms of ID, tickets, the contents of their pockets, and whether they possess an innie or an outie belly button. Also, like with Papers, Please, there are multiple endings, and you have to decide if you're going to side with the government or the resistance, whom you can aid by pursuing secret extra objectives. But unlike Papers, Please, this isn't really a choice. In Papers, Please, I felt like supporting the government might be justified, as they are at least stable, and makes it less likely that the secret police will come round and split my nostrils open with a pair of donkey castrating scissors. But in Not Tonight, the government openly hates you and informs you frequently that given half a chance it will punch you off the white cliffs of Dover onto a little raft full of Mr. Bean DVDs, so why wouldn't you support the resistance? See, Papers, Please was about the struggle of being a good person when survival's on the line and it's easier to keep your head down. You had to work your communist balls off just to get by day to day. Meanwhile, I paid every bill in Not Tonight the day I got it and ended the game with 14 grand in the bank. In retrospect, needn't even have bothered with all that drug dealing on the side. I just figured, why not? There's no consequence, except I lost a few points in social credit. Oh, how embarrassing. How will I show my face at the Ellingsworth's garden party? Yahtzee, are you seriously going to complain about a game simultaneously knocking off Papers, Please and not being enough like Papers, Please? Well, the ways it differ make it a worse game, is me point. Like how you don't get paid by the punter, you have to meet a minimum quota of people let through to pass a mission, so if the game randomly rolls a bunch of guys you can't let through when there's only 10 seconds left, then you're European in the wind, my friend. Well, let's not be too churlish. The pixel art is nice and the writing's solid. The addition of a few character side plots based around inventory puzzles adds a nice enough bit of extra depth. It's just that I feel like in comparison to Papers, Please, it's doing less with more. It's less nuanced, less impactful, and the political commentary is going to be pretty fucking dated in a few years after a few governments change amidst a rise in popular support for giant radioactive cockroach people. Shenmue is a classic game from the Sega Dreamcast that very recently got officially ported to Steam as part of the console world's ever-burgeoning acknowledgement of its own irrelevance. The main things I knew about Shenmue is that it's a primogeniture of the particular kind of Japanese open-world game now exemplified by the Yakuza series, and when Shenmue 3 got announced, all the Sega fans collectively wet their Dr. Robotnik-themed pyjama bottoms. So having now played Shenmue 1, I have to come to the conclusion that they were probably doing it ironically, and I hope their mothers appreciated the joke when Laundry Day rolled around. Shenmue's kind of a bad game. Not that it's boring or miserable to play, it's got a tang of obliviously enthusiastic badness that makes it slightly hilarious, on top of being boring and miserable to play. Hey, people who've been waiting for Shenmue 3, here's a thought. Maybe you could have scratched that itch by watching literally any martial arts film. I'm thinking the plucky young hero who got beaten up by the sneering villain who killed his dad stroke kung fu master at the start probably beats up the sneering villain at the end. And this way you can enjoy the fight scenes without having to smash your controller with a steak tenderizer. What's that, Yarts? Shenmue on the Dreamcast doesn't hold up in this day and age. Thanks for the revelation. Don't forget to inform us that Elizabethan roughs make it difficult to look at your smartphone. Hey, granted there's a lot of clumsiness in Shenmue that can be put down to it still being the awkward developmental years of 3D gaming. The movement controls that feel like we're redirecting a Roomba by strategically kicking it. The way we can zoom into and pick up random objects for no reason except to turn them around in our hands in a way that implies we're supposed to be dispensing a constant stream of thick, ropey cum strands at the mind-blowingly cutting-edge graphics. One could conceivably forgive the QuickTime events because this is the game that arguably invented them, and it took us a while to realise that Q2Es are to narrative game design what firing ping-pong balls out of a vagina is to midwifery. But there is plenty of badness about Shenmue that doesn't take the retrospective view of a mighty space genius from the future to spot. Even the primitive early man of the turn of the millennium could tell that all the conversations sound like every line was recorded on different days, in different rooms with no context and during a gas leak. The plot is, we play Ryo Hazuki, a fairly stock Japanese character, the high school student who is also a karate master and has the emotional range of a plate of egg and chips. Even less actually, since at least you can use the chips to simulate raised eyebrows, using their quiet stoicism to mask their utter cluelessness. A sneering villain comes to his house, beats him up, kills his dad, steals a green drinks coaster, and so Ryo declares vengeance with the raw emotional power that most of us would use to complain about a vending machine failing to work, and sets out to uncover the truth behind the villain and their sinister organisation by walking out of the house and asking his next-door neighbours. In fact, that seems to be Ryo's solution to most of the difficulties in his life, as his entire universe consists of 5 or 6 streets in a Japanese city, populated exclusively by people he knows and incredibly rude bastards who will tell him they're just too busy to talk and are in a hurry to get somewhere while sitting on a bench reading a fucking newspaper. But by the time-honoured method of asking the neighbours, Ryo delves into the seedy underbelly of the 5 or 6 streets, meaning some people who wear dark glasses and muscle shirts and are somehow even ruder than the newspaper assholes. It's here in this early phase of the game that we come to fully appreciate Ryo's cluelessness when he falls on roughly 12 occasions for the old, sure I'll tell you what you want to know, just meet me in this dark alley tomorrow with with 3 of my burly mates. Trick. And thus 2 hours into the game we are suddenly thrown into the deep end of the combat, getting attacked relentlessly on all sides while forced to get to grips with a lengthy list of combos like a drowning man being thrown a flat-packed life belt with half the assembly instructions missing. And it's hard to tell if a blow landed or was dodged because all the combatants frenetically roll around each other like a bunch of action figures in a tumble dryer, so in the end all he can do is get out the old steak tenderizer and do the monster mash. Still, I shouldn't complain about these brief interludes of excitement because I'd spent the last 6 in-game hours waiting patiently in the street for the ambush to start, passing the time by reading the stop signs, and before that I spent 8 hours outside a tattoo parlor waiting for them to open so they could tell me where to go tomorrow to get ambushed. See, I'm not going to rag on the game for not being full-on martial arts action all the way through, and not just because the combat calls for precisely the same button inputs made by an impatient person trying to skip a cutscene. The concept of having to balance the exciting part of the story against the mundanities of everyday life is unique fertile ground for video games, explored by games like Persona 5 and Yakuza, and work simulators like Harvest Moon and Recettear. The problem is, Shenmue's open world just doesn't have anything to do in it between the story beats, besides walk around the neighbours, tell them you have to avenge your father, and listen to them quite rightfully call you a suicidal fuckhead. Otherwise, you can stroke a cat or bum around the arcade playing Space Harrier, neither of which feel like making the most of a bold new era of open world gameplay. And the real kick in the teeth was that after several hours of bumming around getting ambushed as punishment for indiscreetly asking random strangers where the sailors hang out, Ryo's mum or housekeeper or live-in gimp or whatever the fuck she is just goes, "Oh, here's a letter for your dad that's your first actual lead that I forgot about. So everything up to this point has officially been a complete waste of your fucking time, and don't forget to feed the cat." Eventually our detective work takes us to the docks, it never having occurred to Ryo to check there while he was looking for sailors, and we have to get a job moving identical wooden boxes back and forth along the pier over and over again, day in, day out. Finally, the action's picking up. No, really, this is the point when Shenmue turns into a video game, lo and behold. Phew, only took about 6 hours. You have to use actual driving finesse and map reading skills to move a minimum quota of boxes in a time limit, and finally the game can justify the fact that character movement handles like operating a piece of industrial lifting equipment. I was getting into beating my box relocation record and resented the game for constantly interrupting it, so that the bad guys could have another crack at throwing some meatheads at the karate master in the hope that practice will help them get better at being concussed. And inescapably the story rolls on to the insipid to be continued. To me, the experience of playing Shenmue 1 was rather like what I imagine having sex with Ryo Hazuki is like. It just lay there staring resentfully at me as I poked all its bits trying to provoke a reaction. Yes, I'm sure it was influential and very nostalgic for you, but of all the many wonderful properties in gaming, this is the one you're holding out for a sequel to. That's like having 2 perfectly good eyeballs and using them to watch Destructoid videos. Well, I wanted a AAA game to come out, and it doesn't get much more AAA than this. Spider-Man means Sony, it means Marvel, it means Disney, it means they couldn't animate Spider-Man scratching his arse until 6 teams of lawyers had discussed it for a week. You can practically smell the money coming off this one. So of course they're going to milk it till its kidneys plop out. I go to buy it, it goes, "Do you want the standard edition for the usual only faintly extortionate $60 or the deluxe edition for the obviously bullshit $80? You get a whole 3 more missions." Oh, okay, so by deluxe edition, what you meant was intact edition. Unbutchered edition. Edition that wasn't picked apart on the surgeon's table by Dr. Nickel and Dr. Dime. You don't get this in films. They don't bring the lights up halfway through and say, "Could the silver ticket holders kindly fuck off for 20 minutes so the gold ticket holders can watch a few subplots?" Anyway, I went for the standard edition because I wasn't going to let more of this dominate my weekend than necessary. Marvel's Spider-Man is of course a new sandbox game about Spider-Man, a genre that has seen one exemplar, Spider-Man 2 on the GameCube, and a whole load of Spider-Man-ure since then. So let's get straight to the big question. Is Disney's Marvel's Spider-Man a better Spider-Man game than Spider-Man 2? The answer is yes. And that, incidentally, was my entry for the 2018 Most Subtext in a Single Syllable competition. It is, in the sense that Sony's Disney's Marvel Spider-Man does contain a better Spider-Man game. If you broke it down to component bits and selectively reconstructed it, you'd have a perfect Spider-Man game. The problem is, the game also contains every other game that has ever existed in the history of the world, most predominantly Batman Arkham City, and the advice I've given to pretty much every Spider-Man game in the last decade has been stop trying to be Batman. Embrace the things that make you special, Spider-Man. You can't skulk in the shadows, you're dressed like the top of a police car, for fuck's sake. So while the web swinging in Sony's Disney's Marvel Stan Lee's Spider-Man is great, it looks good and requires finesse, and there are races and stunt challenges and boss fights that make the most of it, we also have to do the usual fucking stealthy base assaults. And once again, someone rips off the Arkham-style Predator mission without understanding the ingredient that made them work: escalation. The enemies got twitchier and more scared as you picked them off, the situation evolved. If it doesn't, it gets boring. Isolate, pick off, isolate, pick off. Whoops, no more isolated ones. Distract, isolate, pick off. But what's really galling is that even if I successfully pick them all off with no alerts, half the time the game just spawns more dudes, pre-alerted for your convenience, and you're forced to fight them. I spent 10 minutes going out of my way to careful, stealthy stealth the first round of lads, but apparently I might as well have just blundered in here in a sombrero with my knob out for all the good it... Hang on, why does it say Wave 1 at the top of the screen? Oh, you're just padding this out now. The combat's already somewhat annoying, it's got nice variety, and you can bestow a smorgasbord of blatantly life-threatening spinal injuries upon random goons, but I guess they all got bitten by radioactive rolled-up newspapers, because even basic thugs can knock your health down rapidly, and the spider sense effect that tells you when to dodge is wonky as balls. Sometimes it goes off when nothing nothing's about to hit you. At other times it goes off 0.1 seconds before a hitherto unannounced rocket obliterates your spider nads. So the base assaults are a miserable chore, frankly. Oh well, at least it's still superhero stealth. At least you're not some boring fuck crouched behind a box throwing distraction objects and getting insta-killed the moment you get spotted. I don't like the sound of that cough you just made, marvels Sony's Steve Ditko Spider-Man. Well, the thing is, we thought we could have a few missions throughout the campaign where you play as Spider-Man's normal human mates, crouching behind boxes, throwing distraction objects, and the other thing. You know, for variety. So let me see if I've got this straight, Insomniac Games' Disney Spider-Man. You're going to interrupt your high-octane, big-balls, web-swinging, free-roam superhero power fantasy for the sake of some mandatory forced stealth sections playing as a mundane fuck going on a chest-high wall inspection tour. And you're doing this so that we don't get bored. Yes, downtime is important for pacing, but the downtime in a Spider-Man game is when you blow off the missions for a bit to idly challenge yourself to web swing all the way across the map without losing speed or mentioning that you're from New York. Speaking of the campaign, the story takes another cue from Batman Arkham Asylum, which went, you fucking know who Batman is. Shut up, don't lie. You know who the Joker is, you know who the Riddler is. Let's just get on with the fun and not piss about with origin stories. Marvel's Clive Barker's Spider-Man mostly does that. It's 8 years into Spider-Man's career, there's a rather loose plot existing, mainly as an excuse for a villain showcase. No offense, Spider-Man, but your villains kinda suck. Although it would be weird if you did take offense to that. There's only two kinds: the silly villains, bank robbers with really obvious themes and generic villain personalities, so if you swapped their powers around you couldn't tell the fuckers apart, and the serious villains, who are all former Peter Parker father figures with Jekyll and Hyde issues. Peter Parker really needs to learn to stop latching onto older men, it never ends well. The exception to the no origin stories rule is Dr. Octopus. He gets origin story for days. There's like 90 million plot missions where you just hang around the lab, so Dr. Octavius can drop another hint and make another weird face to camera, until you're going, for fuck's sake, we know he's going to be Dr. Octopus! Stop arsing about and bolt some Japanese rape tentacles to this motherfucker! Marvel's, Disney's, Sony's, Insomniac Games' Stan Lee's, Steve Ditko's giant-sized man thing achieves that wonderful quality of Spider-Man 2, in which it was just fun and not a little zen to while away the afternoon randomly swinging through the streets, stumbling on collectibles and little crimes to foil, which may ultimately be enough, but I feel like saying it's a really good game is like saying the Bible supports the ostracism of homosexuals. It's true, but only if you cherry-pick bits of it from the piles and piles of other stuff. Web-swinging becomes the spoonful of sugar to help keep down the base assaults, the forced stealth missions with other characters, the weirdly elaborate science mini-games where you have to play Pipe Dream and do tile-matching puzzles, which make me think Octavius went off the deep end because he was sick of sitting around the lab playing Dr. Mario all fucking day. This sort of design is the result of seeking the broadest possible audience, but I would argue there is still value in a refined experience. It's a bit unfair that AAA games can afford to just keep throwing bollocks at the wall until some of it sticks. Sticky bollocks are the last thing you want when you're wearing spandex tights. Ah, what a delightful thing it always is to see a video game enter the hallowed ranks of things that have shadows. Now, as well as the Colossus, the Beast, the Damned, the Comet, Mordor, and, the Beast 2, there's also a Shadow of the Tomb Raider. You might say it's just falling back on hackneyed titling cliches because they already used the generic R-word sequel name with Rise of the Tomb Raider, but shadows are important. A shadow can tell you how fat and ugly something is without you having to directly look at it. And that's as fitting a segue into the actual game as we're going to get. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the origin story for how Lara Croft became a Tomb Raider, which might confuse anyone who played the last two Tomb Raiders, which also claimed to be that exact thing. Apparently, it was a trilogy all along. Surprise! I guess you need the full extent of 3 games to fully establish why a person might want to hunt for treasures or murder people who are trying to murder them. The plot for this one is, oh god, it hardly matters. Lara's on a treasure hunt, needs to get to the ancient ruins before the bad guys do, because the bad guys wouldn't treat them respectfully or something, as opposed to Lara, who just accidentally demolishes most of it by climbing all over it with her big fat ass. She picks up a treasure that sets off the countdown to apocalypse, and the bad guys call her a stupid fuck as natural disasters start killing off all the locals, and it's completely her fault. But you have to have sympathy for her, because ages ago her father died and made her quite sad, and alone with nothing to her name but all the money in the universe. Anyway, everyone sort of forgets about that apocalypse thing, and the plot becomes about tracking down a lost city of Incas and doubly-doubly-dum, and at the end we're too late to stop the main bad guy using the ancient magic treasure to turn themselves into a god, the kind of god who walks very slowly around a boss arena and can be killed by shooting them with bullets. Yeah, Lara, I guess it was important we stopped them acquiring this unstoppable power. They might have marched on Washington and been instantly cut down by the National Guard. I'm sure all those dead Mexicans now understand the importance of their sacrifice, you mad cow! Well, now the origin story is officially over, I can state with complete confidence that I can't stand this version of Lara Croft. Admittedly, old Lara Croft seemed to have augmented her tits and bum by extracting material from her personality, but at least there was a sense of fun. Even falling 9 stories onto spikes had this colourful bonhomie about it when her ponytail was dancing merrily about her exposed giblets like Francis Bacon's favourite brush. New Lara is just equal parts boring and apparently psychotic. First, most of her emotional range got blasted off her face in a hideous leaf blower accident, so she reacts to everything from an exploding oil refinery to the death of her pet badger, like she's at the supermarket trying to figure out what kind of toothpaste she wants. Just like last time, she's got a bad case of the have-tos, and And if you take a drink every time she declares that she has to or must do something, then you'll wake up in a dog kennel with your mouth tasting like the inside of a cement mixer, which again gives her the personal agency of a wooden ducky on a string. And let's not forget she's bug-fuck nuts. Villager says, some naughty criminals are giving us trouble. Lara says, oh how terrible, I must help you. And then with no further questions proceeds to start wordlessly dragging people into bushes and slitting their throats, like she's been waiting all fucking day for the excuse to get started. Help me out here, viewers. How has Lara Croft's character developed over the course of this developmental origin story? She was already a super gymnast adventurer archery gold medalist when the first game started. She had a brief case of the Wibblies after her first confirmed kill, but she was chalking them up like a champ inside 10 minutes. She has received a lot of punishment, but if getting the shit beaten out of you is enough to make you a complex and interesting character, then my knob deserves its own Scorsese-directed biopic. Mostly it seems she goes after treasures because someone else getting it first would be bad in some poorly established way, and then proceeds to monotone her way through the subsequent peril. There is the occasional blip of character development that is always quickly squashed like a bubble in wallpaper. On around 12 occasions she thinks she's gotten her big dumb friend killed and starts wondering if maybe this is why nobody comes to her birthday parties, but oh, turns out he's alive, abort character development. Then she thinks the baddies have killed her big dumb friend, so she puts on her Terminator face and goes on a rampage, but again, oh, big dumb friend's still alive, back to sanity. Big dumb friend almost gets through at one point by yelling at her to stop shouldering the whole burden and making things all about her, shortly before she shoulders the whole burden and makes things all about her. But the only revelation she seems to have had by the end of her origin story is that maybe she should just stop bothering with the big dumb friend in future. Oh yeah, and there's this business with avenging her father who was killed by the evil cult conspiracy organization thing we're up against, but she isn't even sure they did kill him till right at the end, and most of the leaders of the evil cult all die off screen, which was probably the highlight of the game comedy-wise. There's this action-packed penultimate battle sequence before the final boss where an easily missed voiceover goes, hey, I've got all the cult leaders in this helicopter, whoops, it crashed and everyone died, butterfingers. Then the secondary villain dies, then the main villain dies. This is all in like 10 minutes, not so much tying up the plot threads as taking a fucking hedge trimmer to them. I don't know if this is coming across, but I really didn't like Shadow of the Tomb Raider very much. I consider it fitting that it used an eclipse as its symbol, because creatively speaking, it's a fucking black hole. The only new idea it had for the gameplay was that now you can hide on plant-covered walls as part of the stealth. I assume this was the result of nepotism. Mr. Chest-High Wall pressured Square Enix to give his layabout cousin a job so he'd get off the weed. It's one of those games where I had real trouble deciding what upgrades to buy from the character menu because they all seemed equally useless as long as stealth kills still work and most enemies go down in a mere smattering of bullets from the assault rifle you are given at no cost. Increase the amount of time Lara can hold her breath underwater? I don't see how you could increase it by much. She's already putting pearl divers to shame. She must have a couple of air pockets concealed in her bra. Speaking of which, did you see that bit in the trailer where Lara's struggling to squeeze her D-cups through an incredibly narrow underwater cave before she drowns? Effective moment that, wasn't it? Devs clearly thought so. They reuse it like 4 times. Not that there's any actual peril. It's an altogether now predetermined action set piece, like half the rest of the game, which is probably why the game world feels so shallow and artificial. There is a modern-style oil refinery literally within a minute's brisk walk of the secret Incan city for no better reason than to have something Lara can blow up at the start of the final act, which she does within about 30 seconds of arriving at it. What do you expect? She's an outdoors woman. She likes hiking. Insurance rates. Ha 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 ha! I like to think I'm always keen to try new things, as long as it doesn't involve my bottom. Trust me, whatever you think I'm missing out on, I'm quite content with the maximum amount of entertainment value that can be extracted from my butthole being doing crosswords on the toilet. Nobody else is talking about your butthole, Yards. I know, I'm just saying. Anyway, the point is, I'd never played a Dragon Quest game before, but I thought I'd give the new one a go, which obviously means I can't say if it's a good Dragon Quest game, but I can certainly compare it to other games and to objects being pushed at my butthole. One thing I did know about Dragon Quest going in is that Japanese people go double downward dog bonkers for it. Like unofficial public holiday every time one comes out bonkers, putting it in impact terms right up there with terrorist strikes and dead princesses. But having played Dragon Quest XI Echoes of an Elusive Age, and yes, I am so going to slowly pervert that subtitle as this review goes on, I am now slightly concerned about the Japanese, as I would about a school friend who confides that they have a crush on the dinner lady, knowing they're going to be driven to suicide by mockery within a week. By me. Like the dinner lady, Dragon Quest's appeal seems to lie in it being a nice, comfortable, unthreatening place, always good for an extra helping of dumplings if you put in the right words. The plot of Dragon Quest XI, Emissions of an Infected Arse, is you are in generic JRPG swords and sorcery fantasy world, east of Java. You are the last surviving heir of a deposed royal house who was found as a baby and adopted by peasant farmers. There's a weird birthmark on your hand that magic occasionally comes out of, and you grow into a strong, handsome lad with a girl's haircut. So when you come of age, your adoptive parent takes you aside and says, look, let's not beat around the bush. You couldn't be more obviously a destined fantasy hero if your high school graduation picture was painted by Boris Vallejo. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be any global crisis going on at the moment that would require a destined hero, so why don't you just wander around the countryside for a bit and destiny will presumably strike at some point. I'm not being dismissive here, that's literally how we start. You go to the royal castle on the off chance that a kidnapped princess needs rescuing, but get thrown in the dungeon because the king's played too many Elder Scrolls games and thinks that's just what you do with destined heroes. We break out within minutes and the plot becomes go from city to city looking for the person who isn't one of the 5 or 6 endlessly repeated NPC models, recruit them to your party, then do whatever they want to do until the next one comes along. By this method, we enlist to our cause a toddler, 2 hotties, an old man, a comedy stereotype of a homosexual, and an actual homosexual. And after the last party member joins, they say, "What do you mean Destiny hasn't struck yet? Alright, let's just gather the 6 Destiny balls, that'll wake the fucker up." I only had 3 or 4 days to play the game in, so I was under no illusion that I'd finished the fucking thing, and I dropped out after the 3rd or 4th ball, about 20 hours in, and still no sign of a big villain. A couple of Darth Vaders, but no Palpatines, you know. But you can see what I mean about comfortable and non-threatening, at least the plot is. Couldn't say the same for the visual design. The characters all remind me of those anime cosplayers who wear masks with anime faces drawn on to look more open quotes authentic. The kind that look like if you woke in the night and saw them at the foot of your bed, it'd be the last thing you experienced before blackness and the sound of tearing cartilage. Well, let's be accepting of cultural differences, which are presumably why pressing start doesn't open the pause menu but turns on auto-run mode. I wouldn't think an auto-run mode would be much use in an RPG. The overworld can be big, but it's full of random encounters, so it's not like you can just point yourself at your destination and then nip off for a quick tea ceremony. Gameplay-wise, Dragon Quest XI Errors of an Illicit Anus embodies a nostalgic if it ain't broke don't mentally progress past the age of 12 attitude with a simple, heavily text-based retro turn-based combat system. Although you can move your character freely around the battle space, possibly as a joke. It seems to be a feature put in for very superstitious people who want to convince themselves that serpentining will actually affect whether or not malicious chimp A will whiff his handful of feces attack, or for very easily amused people who want to stand behind the enemy during battle so that their alert hunched forward pose can become part of a hilarious suggestive tableau. The funny thing about random battles in Dragon Quest XI Elegies of Eddie the Eagle Edwards is that you only ever get into them because you choose to. Random enemies only notice you if you accidentally stumble up one of their nostrils, and you can run faster than them anyway. Even during the what I will only call stealth sections if a small dog nervously pissing on a cello is a string quartet, the armed fanatics convinced that you are the spawn of Satan get winded and stop pursuing you after chasing you the approximate length of my dick. You can literally sprint unmolested through an entire dungeon and back just to use the save point before you take on the boss. But if you don't get into random battles, then you'll be severely underleveled for the fights you have to do. So while the game doesn't force us to run a gauntlet of cricket bats to the arse, it has laid a cricket bat down in front of us and locked the door with a special mechanism that would only open if we fill a jar with our tears. I think it's fair to say the Dragon Quest XI Erections of an Aggressive Emu isn't going to light any fires as an innovative or challenging work. I mean, it's not even half-heartedly clicking an empty barbecue lighter, but that's precisely not what it's setting out to do, and you know what? I think I respect that. As I sailed inexorably through this entirely obvious plot that at times feels like we're playing a D&D campaign that the DM is making up on the spot in the brief moments when he can get off the phone to his divorce lawyer, visiting the standard environments, grasslands, desert, ocean, grasslands, ocean again, fighting twee monsters that all seem carefully designed to be potentially made into plushies to sell on Etsy. I felt myself being taken in. I was sinking down into a cozy warm bath where I could doze blissfully off to a fluffy dream world where no perceptions are being challenged but everything's just nice. But I think it worth mentioning that I could only enter this state after I had muted the music, or to give it its proper name, the fucking music. Yeah, I get the game's dedicated to the retro nostalgia thing, hence the bleep bloop 8-bit battle sounds, and that's why a lot of the music sounds like it came from a 16-bit era MIDI synthesizer, but it also sounds like someone took that synthesizer, turned to the blarp setting to 100%, and proceeded to stomp on it like a grape in a French vineyard. It's minute-long loop after minute-long loop of string and brass sections honking like pigs queuing up to have their throats cut. Let that be the lesson, viewers. Cozy a place as the past may seem, don't forget it also contains potato famines, Hitler, and synth music. I think we've reached the point that sticking the word Origins on the end of your prequel name has become the equivalent of taking your husband's name after marriage. Not technically required, just a societally expected formality. Well, flip my bollocks up like a Venetian blind and tickle the hairy crevices below if it isn't a prequel to the classic Star Control series of PC Space Explorer maps. Except it isn't really, because according to Wikipedia, the original creators aren't behind it and sued for copyright infringement, so the developers of Origins couldn't use any of the plot characters or alien races from the old games, which rather makes me wonder why they were still allowed to call it Star Control. Seems like that's a fucking big oversight if you're copywriting things, but then I don't know much about the law. If I did, I'd have taken those Google Android motherfuckers to the cleaners years ago. Still, Star Control Origins plays well enough like its not predecessors. It's a fairly unique take on space games, which usually fall into one of two categories: the full-on 3D explore dogfight 'em up like your Elite Dangerous, or your 2D strategic tedious 'em up like your EVE Online, all making sure everyone's thermos flasks contain enough space tea before you mobilize the fleet to sector bum sex gamma. All about as fun as slowly inserting your head into a tank of cold centipede jizz. You might think at first glance Star Control leans towards the latter, but don't be fooled by the menu-driven interface or the dry mechanical title. Star Control. Control your stars, madam. They're disturbing the other diners in this family restaurant. No, Star Control is actually quite a light and fluffy affair as space games go, with its main selling points being funny dialogue and pissing about. Everything else, and there's quite a bit of everything else, in some way serves to get you to more places where you can see funny dialogue or make it easier for you to piss about unmolested. So with the core gameplay loop established, the premise is, just as the people of Earth are about to embark upon an exciting new age of space exploration with several "we come in peace" greeting cards under one arm and a load of nukes under the other, we suddenly find ourselves on the radar of an ancient and sinister alien empire who have enslaved most of the cosmos, and it's up to us to discover and to unite the various slave races to restore peace, freedom, and equality to the galaxy. Just this galaxy, though. Fuck those snooty Andromeda wankers. So gameplay takes place on multiple levels. First of all, travelling between planets and star systems. It's all in 2D, so it's just rotate until facing thing you want to go to, then press forward. If thing you want to go to isn't there, you either didn't press forward enough or pressed it too much. Blimey, interstellar travel's more complicated than I thought. The next level of gameplay is exploring planets in your landing craft for minerals and shiny chocolate wrappers, and either your landing craft is about the size of continental Europe, or every planet is titchy enough that even Pluto could steal its lunch money. But you know, corners have to be cut when you're trying to render an entire galaxy. That's why there's only like 8 types of planet and 4 types of wildlife, and why your lander is made of crisp packets and toilet rolls and occasionally explodes because you parked it slightly askew. But you know, repetitive as the planets got, it was always pleasing to explore a new system and find a planet rich in natural resources, and as I touched down to rape it for its every last drop of potential, I ruminated on how lucky the galaxy must feel to have someone like me raping it, and not an ancient evil space empire for once. The third main gameplay mechanic is the combat, when the stars and planets of the nearby environment are converted into little pinball bumpers around which you and your murder partner fight on 2 levels, secondarily with each other, primarily with the sodding controls. It ends up being something like a jousting simulator. You speed towards each other, let fly a bunch of missiles and lasers when you get close, speed off into the distance and start wrestling your ship back around for another run, assuming you didn't slam headlong into a space brick wall. It's kind of like having a breakup conversation with your significant other while the two of you are on opposite ends of 2 funfair pirate ship rides, and you need to blurt out apologies in the brief moment you're in earshot. Once you've befriended a few races and getting a good planet-raping groove going, there can be long gaps between needing to do combat, so you might get caught off guard at inconvenient times when there's nothing in your fleet but 2 wheelbarrows and a banana boat. For the same reason, you don't get much chance to practice combat, so you end up not wanting to use any new ships you've picked up because odds are good it'll get blown up in 2 seconds because you didn't realise it's got the turning speed of an old lady in a crowded charity shop and the main gun only works on alternate weekends. Might be just as well as an option to have the computer do combat for you, but I'm not sure I'd recommend that since it removes most of what constitutes the game part of this video game. The only other time challenging gameplay appears is when the planet you're raping occasionally rapes you back. Yes, I do have to use that word, mother. The interface is very janky, especially when using a controller. There's frequent confusion over what's currently highlighted and what will be highlighted instead if we start moving around. Sometimes it does that thing where you press a button on one menu and it automatically presses a button on the next menu, leading to scenarios where we accidentally start combat in the banana boat when we wanted the wheelbarrow. And then we come to the interstellar map and star search engine when the game officially fucking gives up and goes, oh, just get your keyboard out for fuck's sake. Throw that stupid thing away. It's like someone melted a TV remote in a kidney bowl. Hesitant as I am to complain in this age of patching it in post, which means it might be fixed after this comes out or the entire game replaced with 18 hours of the hamster dance. But all nitpicking aside, the main reason to buy Star Control Revelations is for the writing, which is just as well, as every other mechanic lacks a certain depth. Most of the rest of it's exploration based and you'll be all explored out toward the end. Even planet raping won't excite you like it used to, when there's nothing more worth buying and sometimes you'd rather just cuddle. The combat's officially over once you buy the one laser that auto hits any ship or missile that gets close enough to ask you directions. The dialogue's all that's left, but it might be enough. It does the rare thing of being funny without seeming like it's trying too hard. True, it's annoying how some enemies inflict the same prolonged dialogue tree on you every time you run into their ships when no combination of platitudes won't result in a fight. True, every species apparently only has one appearance and personality to share between them, but hey, Star Trek gets away with it. And every species stroke character has depth and a unique perspective. Even the evil space empire becomes more complex the more you learn. You start to think they're all mouth and no dilithium crystals because they're too old and mired in bureaucracy to maintain a decent depression stiffy. So after all that, I liked Star Control Revengeance. It's a light, snacky bit of fun and adventure in a somewhat awkward package, like an attractive, sexually curious Dalek. Don't be fooled by the 2 asses in the name, viewers. Assassin's Creed is half-assed at best. Oh boy, they stamped out a whole new one that's set in ancient Greece, so who gets to be Leonardo da Vinci this time? As in, the historical celebrity who inexplicably becomes BFFs with the main character within seconds of meeting them, and becomes the major support character to lend a sense of desperate authenticity reminiscent of celebrity cameos on more recent episodes of The Simpsons. Oh, we don't do that in every Ass Creed game, yards. It's Herodotus. Thank you! And in keeping with every Ass Creed game using the previous Ass Creed game as a prototype, like a slinky descending a filthy staircase acquiring more and more dust and mouse turds as it goes, Odyssey is basically Origins with a couple more bits added, which means the fucking leveling system is back again, and the sense of an open world is lost as quests and areas have recommended levels, ensuring that only one portion of the game is worth being in at any one time. It also continues the de-emphasization of stealth. Call me a boring old stick in the mud for expecting a game with the word assassin in the title to be about sneaking and precision, rather than hammering away at an overlong health bar like I'm driving a stake into a concrete floor. A stealth attack isn't a guaranteed kill on a higher level enemy, and it feels like enemies take forever to come out of alert mode if you run and hide, so any attempt at subtlety or cleverness on your part will very frequently give way to prolonged punch-ups with mobs of football hooligans. And I know precisely why this had to be the case, because if you weren't constantly forced into open combat, then you'd have no reason to keep upgrading and replacing your weapons and armor, and Ubisoft wouldn't be able to entice you with high-level gear with bigger numbers winking brazenly at you from behind paywalls, grindathons, and the sequin-covered chastity belts of special editions. But hey, why bring the hate just because Assassin's Creed is different to how it used to be. Ubisoft wanted to be more of an open-world RPG than a sandbox. There's nothing wrong with that. After all, if you want a sandbox, just play literally anything else Ubisoft puts out. Now we're in RPG, we can enjoy the usual benefits of an RPG, that is, a stronger emphasis on story and character development. Can't we, Ubisoft? Look me in the eye, Ubisoft. I said, can't we? Not really. If anything, characters have only become less developed. In stark contrast to Ezio and whatever that dude from Assassin's Creed 3 eventually decided his name was, when we followed the main character basically from birth and learned exactly who they were, why they hate Templars, and how their grip strength became stronger than an obsessive Alan Titchmarsh fan holding on to the very last copy of BBC Gardener's World magazine. Now it's just, they're here, they've already got the skills, and they oppose the Templars because Templars are baddies and baddies are bad. Mustn't let any prolonged character building moments get in the way of the fucking grind. Even the apparently inescapable future bridging narrative I've officially given up attempting to follow, as it seems to be populated exclusively by characters who have had no introduction whatsoever, and yet we're just supposed to know what they're about. But let's talk innovations. You play as one of two siblings of opposing genders in ancient Sparta, which, as I've previously stated, isn't even innovative for Assassin's Creed games. So what innovation does Assassin's Creed Odyssey bring to the series? Well, there's dialogue trees now. That's the new hotness, is it? Dialogue trees. That's like bursting into the avant-garde fashion show and loudly announcing that you've just discovered that oversized t-shirts are good for sleeping in. Oh yes, and I guess it finally sank in that Ubisoft sandboxes are all just go to icon on map, because now there's an optional explorative mode, where instead of going to icon on map, you wander vaguely around the relevant area until the screen lights up going, you are near the thing, call your eagle, look around until an icon appears, then go to icon on map. Not so much removing go to icon on map as adding an extra step to it, like trying to get more exercise by keeping the TV remote on the other end of the couch. Anyway, your character is a mercenary caught up in a war between Athens and Sparta, and a big thing is made of how you can intervene in the war by weakening a territory's leadership until you can participate in a big ground battle to switch the area from blue to red or vice versa. Except at various times you fight for and against both sides, and gameplay-wise there's no difference except the colours of their t-shirts. They all get equal amounts of narcon when you're trying to complete objectives in their soldier camps, and their spears are equally pointy. So I'm a little unclear on why we should care about influencing the war. Why do you need a reason, Yards? Overthrowing a nation always looks good on the old resume. Oh yes, and the ship is back. In Origins, the ship combat was a carnival sideshow, but now it's your main mode of transportation between islands like it was in Black Flag. Thing is, in Black Flag, the ship was the centre of your pirate universe, and everything revolved around it. And now it's just sort of there. Someone conveniently hands you it the instant you need one, and between prolonged grinding on big islands and fast travelling, huge swathes of the game can go by without you needing the ship at all. It's another thing that's there, like the stuff with the war. Assassin's Creed Plodyssey is a game full of things that are there. Quote that for the fucking blurb. There, but not really connecting, like my LinkedIn account. Some of the things that are there, one suspects, because they are things that other popular games have done, usually with a hell of a lot more depth and mileage. You can recruit knocked out enemy soldiers, MGS5 style, and add them to your ship crew, but your ship seems to be capable of getting along perfectly well without enslaved conscripts that hate you. There's a network of named mercenaries that bears a suspicious resemblance to the Nemesis system from the Middle-earth Shadow of such-and-such games, except with none of their personality, and their main role appears to be to materialise while you're in the middle of grindy combat sessions in order to extend the length of the grindy combat session. Do you know how many Assassin's Creed games I've reviewed? 1, 2, 2 and a bit more, 3, Slack Flag, Unity, Syndicant, Orim Minge, and Sodacy makes 10. And while I've given each game varying degrees of shit, I've never once failed to play through the entire story campaign until now. In modern gaming, Assassin's Creed is a fat and awkward member of the gang who occasionally made interesting wheezing noises when we punched him in the gut, but it has finally ceased to amuse. I had been playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey for nearly 40 sodding hours, 40 sodding plodding hours of copy-pasted soldier camps and temples, of hammering away at one overlong health bar after another, like a drinking bird toy trying to eat a king-size Mars bar. And I swear half the characters look the same. I swear King Leonidas and Barnabas the ship captain are the same fucking guy with his beard at different stages of development, and all I could see ahead of me was 40 more hours of the same shit, stretching unbrokenly on from anus to toilet water. You did it, Ubisoft. You beat me. The first Assassin's Creed game I couldn't finish. It can finally take its place alongside everything else I can't finish, like JRPGs, the main courses at American family restaurants, and masturbating to the one nude scene in The Shining. I know Call of Duty and I have had our ups and downs, well, had our downs and more downs, and just when we thought we couldn't go any further down, we broke new ground and discovered a sealed-off basement where a family of horny pigs were passing around the corpus of Modern Warfare 1. But when I saw that COD Blops 4 was coming out, I felt renewed vigour. After having to plough through so many RPGs and open worlds in very limited time, I was in the right mood for a nice straightforward 4-hour story campaign, and hell, as a white person, it'll be nice to see the genetic superiority of my race being confirmed for a little while. That was when COD Blops 4 laid its knob across my porridge for the first time. No single-player campaign. Well, Activision, as Milorad Petrovic said in response to the invasion of Yugoslavia, the fuck? We thought you'd be pleased, Yards. Every story campaign of every COD game you've played in years you call racist and overblown and taken straight from what insecure NRA members see when they close their eyes and touch themselves. At least we didn't hire Kit Harington this time. Granted. But having removed the single player, are you going to charge less for the game? Oh, Yardsy, I can see why people say you're a funny guy. $130 the deluxe version costs. As the water treatment engineer said of his favourite outflow pipe, that's taking a lot of piss. I can see why it's not on Steam. Steam has user reviews. There'd be a big fat mostly negative next to the name before you can say Eric Prince. Still, saying the game has no single-player content would doubtless annoy a few marketing types. Of course there's single-player content, they would say. You can play the tutorial missions as many times as you like. There are 10 playable characters and a little tutorial for each, and they're worth going through just because the person narrating them is the most insecure man in the universe, and for Call of Duty that's saying something. Yeah, press that grenade key. Knock, knock, motherfuckers. It's your birthday and the party clown's here. You're a stone-cold brass-balled killer and you're gonna have their ass for supper. I'd like to put your penis in my mouth. I mean take you to a steak restaurant and barbecue an entire cow using nothing but the pressure cooker effect of my giant balls. He's great. It's like listening to Jeremy Clarkson's stream of consciousness while he's using the communal shower at the YMCA. And by doing these missions, you also unlock the story. For the story had to be somewhere. Without story, there's no context, and even a multiplayer game needs context. Shut up, yes it does. If you don't need context, there are literally hundreds of ways you could scratch your itch of wanting to shoot human-shaped things with a gun, although maybe stick to video games if you're planning to do it more than once. Story cutscenes are gradually unlocked as you complete the character tutorials, so here's the story as I understood it. Very rich white lady is sad because her sister died in a gun battle, and in response gathers 10 elite mercenaries from around the world so that they can gun battle, in aid of something. She says something about ending war, but I don't think you do that with gun battles. That's like enlisting major game publishers in a campaign for reasonably priced entertainment. Then she betrays the mercenaries for some reason, and that's your lot. For the reasons described above, the 10 mercenaries will now gun battle an infinite number of clones of each other in various enclosed industrial environments for the rest of time. Ooh, maybe they're all dead and in purgatory yards. Oh, shut up, viewer, you always say that. Just because Lost confirmed it, you think you know everything now. There's an air of desperation about COD Blops 4. If it had a subtitle, well, a sub-subtitle, it'd be, What the fuck do you people want? It's basically a collection of gameplay modes that several phenomenally popular other games have all done before, and less blandly. Its challenge is not so much finding an audience as it is luring that audience away from the games it already has. The 10 playable characters in the, I hesitate to call it, main multiplayer mode smacks of Overwatch-style hero shooters, but the characters just aren't distinct enough. It takes more than different hairdos and a greater variety of accents than a French punctuation manual. They're all basically the same size and speed, and their unique weapons and abilities take time to warm up, so most of the time is spent running around blasting assault rifles at each other, and again there are plenty of games where you can do that, some of which don't run like complete garbage on graphics cards more than 6 months old. And then of course there's the PUBG mode. We'd prefer you call it blackout mode, Yards. Well, that's very adorable of you, but it'll take more than terminology to disguise the fact that it's just PUBG. I suppose the lesson that Fortnite taught us was that PUBG's audience is completely up for grabs to anyone who can rip off PUBG without being quite so buggy and awful. But there's something particularly cynical about a big AAA franchise doing it, presumably hoping a cozy and familiar name on the top will draw them in like a supermarket-owned brand packet of fish fingers. And the third gameplay mode is that co-op zombies thing that's been hanging around Call of Duty for years now, like a friend zone nice guy constantly thinking they must be one more bad-mouthed boyfriend away from getting some of that. Now, as you all know, not being into this whole human society thing, I'm not big on online multiplayer, and as such don't have much constructive criticism for how the game actually plays. When I joined public matches, I'd do a quick poll of the other players and ask them for one small change they'd suggest to balance the game, and Treyarch will be pleased to know that I now have about 85,000 suggestions for very simple changes, and they might also be interested to hear that they're all a bunch of cucks. However, there is one criticism I can make with complete confidence, and that's that the entire menu interface is complete dog shit. You wouldn't think this would be difficult, new game options quit, especially not when there's like 100 guys working on it, but that's it, isn't it? Boiling an egg is easy, but if you've got 100 guys in your kitchen trying to boil one egg, you won't achieve much beyond violating the fire code. You have to wade through screen after screen of shitty rectangles to do anything. I was trying to read all the dossiers for the 10 characters because God knows I wasn't getting much context from playing as the fuckers, but I had to go 3 screens deep and back just to switch characters, and the text fucks up in every way it is possible to fuck up a simple text box. There's more than enough space to display all the text at once, but they put it in a tiny box anyway and auto-scroll it, and when it reaches the bottom, if you're not finished reading, fuck you, back to the top. It's like trying to read the side of a truck as it rolls down a hill into a burning slurry pit, and I'm harping on it because it reflects the complacency and utter contempt for the audience with which this game thinks it can do nothing but present a box of scraps it ripped off better games and charge $100. I suppose the question is, would you prefer to plan a day out to do one specific thing, like scuba diving or seal clubbing, or go to Disneyland and do 4 or 5 shallow imitations of interesting things, all with this constant nagging sense that someone's trying to steal all your money and children? Ah, this is one of those moments that make it all worth it, viewer. One of the 3 basic pleasures of life. The first wank on a delicate spring morning, finally killing the last witness, and playing a new game that I actually like. Not just like, one that took me completely by surprise and genuinely excited me with an originality and freshness that has long since faded from spring morning wanks. I bought Return of the Obra Dinn on Steam while casting a broad net for indie games to review, and because it looked nautical themed, and I've recently been rereading my Horatio Hornblower books, so imagine my delight to see on the title screen that it was developed by Lucas Pope, the dude who made Papers, Please. Just goes to show that having a proven auteur creative in charge with the balls to stick his name on the front is still a far more effective marketing tactic than just, say, a picture of a dirty man holding a gun in an irresponsible manner. Imagine my further delight when the game completely drew me in like a lonely sarlacc. Lucas Pope seems to have a talent for coming up with unconventional new core gameplay loops that turn a cold, bureaucratic process like filling out paperwork into something surprisingly engaging, and then underhandedly tells an interesting story through that loop without interrupting it. First, I should say that Return of the Obra Dinn isn't for everyone. Wow, that's a fucking useless sentence, isn't it? Nothing's for everyone, except maybe Oxygen and Pixar films. But speaking personally, Return of the Obra Dinn almost felt like a game that was specifically made for me, as someone who likes crossword puzzles, Horatio Hornblower books, and people being killed. The premise is you are an insurance investigator. Whoa, slow the fuck down, Lucas Pope. This roller coaster's off to a hot start. And you come aboard a hitherto thought lost ship that drifted into English waters with its entire crew apparently suffering from a bad case of not there. After determining to your satisfaction that they aren't all waiting below decks preparing a surprise party, you acquire a sketch of each crew member and a list of names, and your task is simply to assign the correct name to each sketch as well as how they died. And the only tool you have to hand is a magic pocket watch that allows you to relive the last few seconds of a dead person's life and enter and walk around the precise moment in which they expired. Yeah, I guess that is a pretty big only. I mentioned in the Unavowed review that I appreciate a game that makes me feel clever because God knows precious little does since the stroke, and that's exactly what Obra Dinn does, for you see, most people when seconds from death aren't courteous enough to say things like, "Oh no, I, Third Officer Eric Braithwaite, am soon to die, but at least I'm in the company of my friends Bob and Hercules, cough, cough, splatter, splatter." Most of the crew will have to be identified through keen deduction from scraps of clues and processes of elimination, and that's where I felt clever. It was thanks to having read Horatio Hornblower books that I was able to recognise a midshipman when I saw one. A degree of general knowledge is required to identify people's nationalities, or what a top man does as opposed to a seaman. If it helps, top men are generally concerned with the rigging and what goes on above decks, whereas seamen is a white liquid that comes out of your penis when you think about Jenny Agutter too much. Often you just have to take an educated guess, like when you have to decide which of the two female passengers looks the most virginal. The game confirms your correctly deduced profiles in groups of 3, which strikes probably the ideal balance between allowing for some guesswork and not letting you cheese everything by plugging in one name after another like you're reading off the school register. Having said that, you're probably going to have to cheese it when it comes to the 4 identical Chinese top men. I have it on good authority that there is some method of telling them apart, but whatever it is, I doubt it's easier than randomly swapping their names around until you get a hit, like you're fussing over seating arrangements with a very indecisive bride. And through the process of filling out the death certificates, we gradually piece together the story of what happened to the ship. It's a fairly incomplete story since there wasn't someone dying at every single moment. I know, how inconsiderate of the doomed fuckers, so don't expect to be held by the hand through it, but what I could glean from suggestion and the occasional massive, angry, potentacled overstatement certainly made me intrigued enough to want to keep pushing through and learning more. Now, I have a soft spot for the solo auteur indie developer. It's exactly what I'd be doing if I didn't have all these reviews to make and novels to write and crime scenes to scrub. And obviously a solo developer has a lot of limitations. Don't expect a high-definition rendering of an 18th century sailing ship with environment mapping on every splinter-filled todger. But Lucas Pope embraces those limitations. How convenient that the format of exploring single frozen moments in time means that he didn't have to do any character animation. A full 3D game by one guy is obviously going to look like sautéed buttock, so why not push it to a point of maximum buttock and somehow come back around to looking good? And that's why all the graphics are rendered using only pixels of 2 colours, like an antique monitor. You might find it a bit harsh on the old eye if you're not a fan of dithering, but try to think of it as part of the challenge, trying to discern faces and firing lines through an indistinct haze of poorly pigmented pixel pillory. I find the combination of a historical setting and retro PC graphics conjures a nostalgic memory of playing shit like Oregon Trail on the school computer, where you were supposed to be learning something but were just naming party members after that one smelly girl in class and laughing when she caught dysentery. I do have complaints. I kinda completely despise the music. Yeah, I know, solo developed, don't expect the Tokyo Philharmonic, but that doesn't excuse the way it loudly and repetitively blops away while you're trying to think, and of course there's no separate volume controls. Relatedly, I also don't like how the game forces us to wander around each memory, getting unskippably blarped at for a minute before the event gets officially unlocked and we can start taking notes. It's weird that the music's so annoying when the rest of the sound design is fucking top-notch. Voice acting, ambient sound, and especially the little radio plays that accompany the death flashbacks. I couldn't say for sure if it accurately reproduces the sound of a bloke getting torn in half by a giant calamari platter, but it certainly made me cross my legs uncomfortably. If I have sold you on Return of the Cobra Commander, then consider this advice before you play. Try to fucking savor it. Like, play it for just 1 hour a night or something, because after I finished it, I felt the sudden melancholic realization that I could only experience it for the first time once. Tragically, the nature of the deductive gameplay means it has virtually no replay value, but fuck it, why give up so easily? You can achieve some wonderful things with head injuries, as my nursery school teacher used to say. So I think we should call these last 2 weeks something like games by auteur developers whose titles I had to double check to make sure I'd written them down properly fortnight, or perhaps we could just call it not finished with Red Dead Redemption 2 yet week. But I was interested to play Deep Breath, The Missing J.J. Macfield in the Island of Memories, because it was a new game by Swery, he of Deadly Premonition and latterly of D4 Dark Dreams Don't Die. Yeah, you remember that episodic game with Kinect controls and the cat that was a sexy woman. Although I'm not sure we can technically call it episodic, because the prerequisite for an episodic game is that it has to have some fucking episodes come out. Guess it did turn out pretty over-optimistic to call it Season 1, eh, Swery? Still, lessons learned, so this time Swery's decided to make an indie 2D platformer. Blimey, not so much scaling back as completely descaling, gutting, and selling to a fishmonger. J.J. Macfield and the Island of Dr. Moreau is Swery's take on the genre of arty 2D scary very world keep moving right until we tell you to stop indie platform games as epitomized by the likes of Limbo and Inside, except instead of a small child with a big head, you're a schoolgirl with a stupid hairdo. Because it's a Japanese developer, I guess. Japan has this weird thing, named Swery, sorry, couldn't resist. Japan has this weird thing where every imaginable theme and genre of fiction has to be explored through the medium of schoolgirl. Horror, comedy, giant robots, porn, detective drama, bullet hell shooter, porn again, you name it, Japan's got a schoolgirl version. I can't think of any equivalent for this in any other country. It'd be like if every kind of game or TV show made in Canada had a version with Mounties in it. But I know what you're thinking, interested viewer. Japanese schoolgirls, arty keep moving right platformer, this all sounds rather by the numbers, and not at all like the imagination that brought us Sexy Lady Who Is a Cat. Well, don't worry, JJ Macfield in the Chamber of Secrets certainly has Swery's unique blend of warped Americana, inconsistent emotional tone, and sudden hideous violence. At the beginning of the game, the main character is struck by lightning and dies, and then under the supervision of a moose in a lab coat, must slowly and painfully regenerate with a noise like my dad eating lobster before descending into a fit of sobbing as the title appears and an upbeat love ballad plays. Sorry I doubted you, Swery, you fucking lunatic. But let's contextualize this as best we fucking can. The protagonist got struck by lightning while searching for her missing girlfriend who she went camping with on the titular island, and after acquiring unexplained regeneration powers must continue making progress rightwards largely by inflicting a series of horrifically traumatic injuries upon her nubile, characteristically undernourished Japanese schoolgirl body. Remember that game Never Dead? No, not surprised you don't. Came and went like a dose of the squirts, that one. It was that action shooter about an immortal bloke who could lose all his limbs and his torso and keep fighting. I remember saying at the time that the concept didn't work very well in an action game because however unmoved a person might be by the loss of all their arms and legs, it's only making it exponentially harder to turn the situation around. But it might work with something puzzly or explorative, doing the Samus Aran morph ball trick but with severed heads. JJ Macfield and the Nibble Nobble Nunu is basically what I meant. You put yourself into states known only to the furtive night terrors of air crash investigators to access specific areas and solve puzzles. So as well as flinging body parts onto things for justifiable reasons, probably, there are puzzles where JJ needs to transfer fire to something, so of course she sets herself alight. She's in a forest full of dry twigs, but hey, if you've got regeneration powers, it's like when you buy a really expensive pizza cutter but you don't eat pizza that often so you start using it on sandwiches. Also, you can subject her to particularly hideous spine-mangling injuries to make the world turn upside down. Now, it's not that that doesn't make 100% perfect sense, nor the constant bone-splintering sound effects like she's trying to talk through a mouthful of dice. It's that these basic processes are always drawn out so long that the game moves at a very sluggish pace. You've got to mangle and unmangle yourself over and over again for the puzzles, and unmangling always takes about half an hour of extreme self-chiropractic, and when you are mangled, you can only move at a snail's pace, falling over every 2 steps and banging your head on the floor, which was only funny the first 19 or 20 times. But don't take my word for the game being too slow, because after you finish the game, you unlock double speed mode, which means that it was considered a reward. Ooh, you were this close to a revelation there, weren't you, Swery? My game's more fun when you play it at double speed. It'll have to be a super special bonus unlock then. The puzzles are straightforward enough. There was one in a bowling alley that I didn't like much because it used somewhat arbitrary logic that didn't even involve maiming myself. But let's stop picking at the sprouts and jam our fork right down the middle of this beef Wellington. JJ Macfield and the Hendersons is an arty game, and there's a tendency in video game discussion, I think, for the conversation to abruptly end at that point. Oh, this game's a bit surreal and inscrutable, that's because it's an arty game. Oh, well, that explains it. But isn't art supposed to be about conveying a specific idea or message? The message of JJ Macfield and the thing on the doorstep feels confused. Swery lays some cards on the table right at the start with a little opening text saying something like, "No one should feel bad for being who they are. I'm Swery and I'm one of the good ones." And that, plus the fact we're searching for our girlfriend, makes me think it's a metaphor for coming to terms with your sexuality. But in that case, what's all the tearing all your arms and legs off business about? Is that a metaphor for scissoring during that time of the That was the new worst thing I've ever written. Maybe it's not so much the injuries as the regeneration that's the point. Oh sure, love feels painful now while you're young, but soon you'll realise how superficial it all was after you grow up and become dead inside like the rest of us. But what does the stabby chase monster represent? Societal disapproval? Self-loathing? How much we hate waiting for a hairdresser appointment? Probably the second one, because in one of Swery's trademark massively inappropriate lurching shifts of tone, we also bring in teen suicide, and then at the very end something happens that makes me think, and here I'm going to spoil something, so if you don't want to hear it, mute the video or cover your ears. Quick, quick, here it comes! It might have been about transgenderism all along. I think the presentation confuses the message somewhat, turns into a sort of Rorschach test of an arty game. Swery approaches the themes the same way he approaches Americana, as an outsider with a possibly overly romantic view of the subject. Well, I don't know much about Swery personally. I'm assuming he's not a suicidal teenage lesbian. Maybe he identifies as one. Yards, don't be oppressive. How dare you oppress me? I identify as someone who isn't oppressive. Well, I managed to get through the story of Red Dead Redemption 2, and I have to say I'm quite shook. Possibly the emotional impact, more likely from delirium tremens. Didn't have a single moment to myself. Saturday afternoon I was like, oh boy, I've finally reached the epilogue. Maybe I'll actually have Sunday free to relax on. 8 hours of additional story later. Fuck me, my definitions are out of date. I had no idea that epilogue now means entire second game. Rockstar Games used to reliably put out at least one game a year, but Red Dead Redemption 2, or more accurately Red Dead Revolver 3, or more accurately Grand Theft Auto with Angry Cowboys 2, or more accurately the game where the horse does plop plops, is the first game they've brought out since 2013. Oh dear, Rockstar, did GTA Online's little spine finally break and now you can't wring any more cash out of it? Or more likely, were you sitting atop your giant pile of money one day player and thought to yourself, maybe we should spend some of this money on something, because I'm starting to suffer the effects of oxygen deprivation. The result is about what you'd expect, although I'd have expected the horse to be pooing diamonds for how fucking indulgent this game is. Alright Rockstar, I know your sandbox games tend to have somewhat sprawling plots, but just give us a quick summary of RDR2 and don't be too confusing. Well, RDR2 takes place before RDR1. Oh, you fucked it up already, Rockstar. 2 doesn't come before 1. Always had a blind spot for numbers, haven't you? That's probably why the 9th GTA game was titled GTA 4. So while the first Hardy-Ha was set in the last days of the Old West, Hardy-Ha-Who is set in the last but one days of the Old West when the gang of idealistic outlaw Dutch van der Linde is seeking a place to hide out after a botched robbery. In fact, this is the plot of basically every chapter in the game. Dutch plans a robbery, the robbery fucks up, we move hideouts to the next relevant area of the map, new chapter. We play as Dutch's number 2, a cowboy so generic that when the game started it took about 10 minutes of dialogue heavy riding through the snow for me to figure out which of the several generic cowboys with speaking parts was the one I was controlling. And our protagonist's personal arc consists of gradually realising that Dutch doesn't have a plan and might just be a complete arsehead. Something the audience figured out the first time they saw his soul patch. I must say, it's nice to be playing a sandbox that isn't by Ubisoft, especially because Rockstar sandboxes are always less focused on mechanics and numbers and more on story. There's very little in the way of RPG elements or ability upgrades. In stark contrast to Assassin's Creed Flawdacy, where I was switching to new better weapons and armor every 3 seconds like a teenage boy going through Kleenexes, I got through the latter 40 hours of RDR2 using the same Lancaster repeater to the point that I was wondering if the ejection port was wide enough that our marriage could finally be consummated. Which means the game runs into the same problem that RDR1 had, in that none of the side activities or missions offer much benefit besides money, and there's not much to spend that money on, besides haircuts and apples for your horse, which help keep your horse's stamina and health up, and when your horse goes plop-plops you can congratulate yourself on having made a contribution. You can also buy food and supplies for yourself to appease the mild survival elements, but you can just as easily pick them up lying around everywhere for free. Or hunt rabbits. And by hunt, I mean fail to notice getting crushed beneath your charging hooves like a lost toddler on Black Friday. Allow me to quickly throw a little speed trap in front of the pedants stampeding this way. Yes, you can buy upgrades for your gang's camp, which have the vital effect of scattering more tinned peaches around or improving the communal stew, none of which have much profound impact on moment-to-moment gameplay, with the glaring exception of the fast travel map. I would advise saving up to unlock the fast travel map as soon as possible and then blowing all your money on hats, because as beautifully realised as the world and its characters are, most of what you actually do is go on very long horsey rides and then get into a token shootout that the NPCs who brought you here pinky promised wouldn't happen this time, but which we all knew damn well had to happen because it wouldn't be a game otherwise. Rockstar sandboxes are somewhat formulaic. You're always a cynical mercenary type who regards everyone he meets with open contempt, but always does what they ask him to do anyway, and every single story mission plays like a tutorial for a gameplay mechanic you're never going to use again. The writing's usually what saves it. Dutch's gang consists of about 20 distinct and diverse characters, all of whom you can organically converse with and get to know, as at the back of your mind you wonder when and how all the ones who didn't appear in RDR1 will inevitably die. Dutch's gang being so well realised contrasts glaringly against every other gang, family, police force and boy scout group in the world, consisting of a seemingly inexhaustible supply of generic thugs for token combat's sake. But this is where a sort of pure role-playing element comes into things. When the gang decide to have a celebratory piss-up, will you role-play as someone who mingles at social functions, joining in with the singing and getting rat-arsed, or as the kind of person who goes to bed at 9 and bangs on the wall for the rest to keep it down? Either way, you will always be role-playing as someone who has lost all sensation in their arms and legs and can't even walk up to a dog without accidentally kicking it in the head, because Rockstar's engine still prioritizes realistic physics and momentum above our being able to effectively move around. What they set out to do with RDR2 was create an immersive world where you can just roam, discover, and let things happen to you. Shame that goes completely out the window the instant you start any mission, during which you're constantly yelled at by NPCs until you follow a rigidly determined sequence of events, with all side activity and random encounters gagged and locked in the car boot so the aforesaid NPCs can drone on about bullshit for the whole ride. It's not forcing you to enter missions, but you can only drink in the scenery and hog-tie suffragettes for so long. Frankly, RDR2's realistic world only impresses me the same way I'd be impressed if you drank a litre of cooking oil, more so by the effort than the wisdom behind it, because so little of what you see and do in RDR2 is actually fulfilling on a story or challenge level. The horse going plop-plops sums it all up nicely. I can't envision a scenario in which a lack of horse plops would knock a half star off an otherwise perfect score, but there it is, a drop in an ocean of pointless decadence, and this isn't one line of code, horse_plop-plops equals 1. Someone had to texture and animate it and trawl sound effect libraries for the ideal plop-plop sound, and they could have been using that time to cradle their children or make something creatively fulfilling like Obra Dinn. The fact that someone had to do it for their job makes me think of a restaurant manager loudly humiliating a waiter because he thinks it'll impress the customer. Well, it doesn't, Mr. Rockstar, and now I'm going to have to be very cautious about ordering the meatballs. Call of Cthulhu is a game based upon the works of H.P. Lovecraft, America's favourite racist. And alongside the large numbers of horror games inspired by the Cthulhu mythos over the years, Call of Cthulhu can certainly claim the lofty title of another one. Come on, Yahtzee, be nice in the opening spiel. You've got 6 whole paragraphs to dump asparagus urine on the game. Well, you certainly can't deny that it's an extremely dedicated adaptation, as in they set out to make a Cthulhu game, but when it came to deciding which specific story or aspect of the Cthulhu mythos to adapt, someone got a bit overexcited and said, let's do all of it, like at once. Can we do that? And so an attempt was made to see how many of the cliches of Lovecraftian storytelling we can can squeeze into one small game before its delicate little rectum bursts, even a few that Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth didn't already do. So with all that in mind, how could the main protagonist not be a grizzled private detective with a drinking problem and a dark past in early 20th century New England? And how could they not get called out on a routine investigation to a highly suspect isolated community with a permanent green filter over it like the whole island's been dipped in snot? But to say the protagonist Edward Pierce is basically the main dude from Dark Corners of the Earth would be to miss out on the opportunity to say that he's basically the main dude from Vampire. Quite eerily so, actually. Same face, same beard, same voice. The only real difference is the specific nature of their drinking problem. Wait a second. Same fucking voice actor? Talk about typecasting. I checked and the games are by different developers, although they are both French and therefore probably incestuous. Call of Cthulhu is by Cyanide Studio, who are best known for Cycling Manager 2, Space Marine Deathwing, and Cycling Manager 3. Not exactly big-time award winner types, unless there's an award for world's most basically competent mid-range developer. But anyway, Edward Pierce is hired by rich Uncle Pennybags to investigate the suspicious death of his daughter, an artist whose paintings have a slightly alarming habit of making people go Toblerones in the eye sockets mental. Also, she'd been living in a remote fishing community that seems to be muddling on suspiciously well for there not being that much fish around, and all the locals treat you like a black person in an affluent Midwestern suburb because you haven't got boggle eyes or smell faintly of death and sandwich tuna. So by now, your Cthulhu game bingo card should have more crosses than an infant graveyard in an anti-vaxxer community, but ironically, Call of Cthulhu misses out on the free space by forgetting that the defining element of Lovecraftian horror is the fear of the unknown, and Call of Cthulhu just can't make things known fast enough. Sorry to keep bringing it up, but Dark Corners of the Earth shows how pacing is supposed to be done, at least in the bit before it turns into a crappy stealth shooter, when you can feel tension slowly escalating until you find yourself getting chased over a rooftop and stumbling upon a fish finger in a negligee. In Call of Cthulhu, meanwhile, Pierce is barely off the boat and getting the stamp on his Lovecraftian protagonist rewards card before he's stumbling on secret cultist lairs and getting thrown into the usual local franchise of stock horror asylum, where they had to fire the cleaning staff to pay the electricity bill. I think the moment the game officially lost me was when a giant spindly monster climbed out of a painting for a surprise stealth section in full view with no subtlety or build-up, and it might as well have been wearing a top hat. And it wasn't even much of a surprise, because ever since I'd entered the room, Pierce had switched from searching the cupboards I clicked on to wanting to hide inside them, which instantly informed me that either we were about to have a stealth section or Edward's social anxiety problems were kicking in. Which might as well bring us to the gameplay. Call of Cthulhu is on the surface an investigative game patterned with basic use key indoor inventory puzzles, accessorized with dialogue trees and light stealth. Very light stealth, actually. It struggled to leave a finger mark in a bowl of watery custard. Run away from an alerted human guard and turn precisely one corner, and they'll usually write you off as a mystical vanishing wizard, and it's far more important that they investigate the mystery of the nearby stain on the wallpaper. The spindly monster is a bit more dogged and can insta-kill you as soon as it catches up, but it's more irritating than scary. In fact, I don't remember feeling the least bit scared by any of Call of Cthulhu, which for a horror game is a big red cross and a see me note. The world of the game just didn't feel real enough for me to get sufficiently immersed. I found it slightly hilarious how Pierce has a special designated horror face, where his eyes are all boggly and his hair's mussed up, that he flips to like a fucking toggle switch every time something weird happens. But I'm with you, weird-faced version of Pierce. I do get the feeling there's something very wrong with this island. The main town appears to consist only of several empty wooden sheds and a pub, populated by about 15 copy-pastes of the same three guys. The story feels patchy, like bits of it are getting skipped over. You escape from McHorror Asylum, or rather the basement of McHorror Asylum, with still the top part of McHorror Asylum to worry about, I'd have thought, and the game goes, hooray, you escaped, and now you're back in the house you were in earlier that you've decided to use as a hideout, and a bunch of other characters are there and are now your best friends. Sorry you missed all that, but you seemed really into that loading screen and we didn't want to interrupt. There's this gangland boss character who gets built up for the whole first half of the game as a major player that everyone's scared of, and they just fucking disappear without payoff before the end, and sit out the finale eating Twixes in the green room. See, I assumed the patchiness was because the game was going for branching paths and was swapping characters and events around based on my actions. There are heavily emphasized choices that do the Telltale Games thing, where it flashes up a bit of text saying things like, Yog-Sothoth will remember you did that. Also, the RPG elements let you put points into things like eloquence and psychology to unlock new paths and dialogue choices, but as I discovered on my second playthrough, this was all theatre. The RPG elements and the sanity meter, whoops, another cross for the bingo card, are all a paper-thin veneer to make you think your path isn't completely predetermined. Most of the events that reduce sanity are mandatory, and even if you skip the few optional ones, Edward Pierce goes just as banana flapjacks nutty at precisely the same point in the story as before. In the end, the only thing your choices affect are what options are unlocked on the ending Tron 3000, and after going over the guide, what choices unlock what seems to be completely arbitrary. Say yes to character A, drink the whiskey in Act 4 and stick an olive up your nose to unlock ending 1. Say no to character A, molest the baby harp seal and put on the kilt instead of the chastity belt to unlock ending 2. Pull your trousers down, select quit to desktop and open your preferred web browser to unlock slightly more fulfilling afternoon. Fallout 76 is a new Fallout game thoughtfully named after its projected average review score. That was the joke I was gonna go with, on the assumption that it would be the usual Bethesda fare, nice looking but bland and inexplicably popular like most American television presenters. But goodness gracious, Fallout 76 has taken a drubbing in the user reviews. The Metacritic page has produced more red circles than the average venereal infection. Don't tell me that those dastardly unpleasable fanboys who ruined Diablo Immortal's big day in the spotlight have struck again. How dare those horrible nerds make such spoiled, entitled demands for reasonably priced franchise installments targeted at the people who made that franchise popular in the first place. It's just bullying, really, isn't it? If only these dissatisfied consumers with very little actual power and influence would stop bullying the poor, innocent, massively wealthy corporations and leave them in peace to hack out inferior garbage designed to siphon money from idiots and exploit what positive emotions remain unstrangled out of existence. Yeah, push that narrative, games industry. It worked for the Ghostbusters reboot. So what is it about Fallout 76 that's teabagging everybody's grandmas? Well, for one thing, it's angling rather blatantly for the open world survival crafting thing that, strangely for such an ambitious concept, has always been more the territory of your smaller developers, your Rusts and your Ark Survival Evolves and your Minecrafts, if you're of an archaeological bent. At least it was back when survival crafting was a hot trend. Fallout 76 is jumping on this bandwagon way too fucking late. The bandwagon pissed off months ago and is currently touring the South Coast. But that's development times for you, and hey, never say die, could always patch in a battle royale mode. But the reason lower budget developers were doing the survival crafting games is because such things don't really need anything except a world. No obligation for deep storytelling or complex gameplay, just a bunch of crafting rules, and leave the players to find their own fun, building working computer processors with golden cocks coming out the top. Accordingly, Fallout 76 lets you loose on the map with a slap on the bum and a hearty "get building those cocks, and remember to take lots of pictures for social media, you little word-of-mouth money spinners, you." But sadly, Bethesda couldn't leave well enough alone, presumably because there were a lot of employees who had to look busy at least until they'd covered this month's mortgage payment, and Fallout 76 tries to be a Fallout RPG as well, ultimately satisfying no one but the Blandness Preservation Committee that doesn't exist. The story is, you were in a nuclear bunker and got let out to the post-apocalyptic wasteland, blah blah blah, but the bunker was entirely on the level, wasn't subjecting its residents to weird experiments, and the overseer seemed to be a perfectly reasonable human being, which made me wonder if the story writer had ever fucking played a Fallout game before. The game has no human NPCs, a fact that the marketing blurb is weirdly keen to point out. Hey, look at all this work we didn't do. The implication being that the human players create the content. Fair enough, but sadly it's a lie. There are NPCs. No humans, just robots and disembodied voices, but they still talk to you and give you quests, so the no human NPCs thing just feels like an arbitrary self-imposed restriction that doesn't do much more than make the game world feel empty. For the other players don't make their presence felt very much. If your browsing history is anything like mine, well, first of all, delete your history, you sick bastard, and you've no doubt been seeing that live-action Fallout 76 advert with tiresome frequency. It's been constantly popping up like a nervous orgy hostess, that one. It depicts achingly diverse groups of players having communal wasteland fun times with the tone of an online dating advert, dishonestly depicting smartly dressed attractive people meeting in romantic locations with neither party trying to eat the other one's skin. Yeah, that wasn't representative of my experience, when at any time there'd be like 10 players scattered across the entire map. I only interacted with someone once, when I was curious to know what was making the sound of a baby crying and a couple having an argument. It turns out that any slightest noise your mic picks up will be fucking broadcast over a 200-yard radius, so bear that in mind before you start jerking off to something on the other monitor, lest you attract hordes of players curious to know what's making a sound like a small dog enthusiastically eating pancakes. The deliberate emphasis on multiplayer means that the solo RPG experience has had a lot of the air let out of it, and the result plays like a version of Fallout 4 that was partially taped off of cable TV by a dodgy VCR. Combat is a repetitive affair, with limitless quantities of Fallout brand zombies whose AI just about permits them to move towards you and then slide back and forth like a frozen hot dog on the floor of a moving bus. Gamely, the developers attempted to adapt the VATS system to the new format, but as our nagging mothers ever persistently failed to understand, you can't pause a multiplayer game, so enemies can keep moving while you're choosing what to target. Rather than a chance to strategically plot your next few actions, the VATS is now a cheat system for people who can just about summon the effort to vaguely point at the enemy, but can't be bothered to finish the job. Hey, I let other people work the fine details out, I'm the ideas gunman. As for the survival elements, such things hinge on resources being limited, and in accordance with my usual experience with Fallout games, the issue was not so much finding a steady supply of Wasteland Mars bars, as it was finding room for them all in my Wasteland bum bag, alongside the free ammo that spurts from fallen enemies like apologies from a Canadian teenager after their first sexual encounter. So the people wanting a Fallout RPG will find a heavily watered down one with no strong plotline to keep it interesting, and the people wanting a multiplayer survival crafter will find a load of Fallout RPG stuff getting in the way, so once again a play for broad appeal ends up appealing to no one. And while my grousing about COD Blops 4 lacking single player was shaky when the story campaigns in such games always hang off the main draw of multiplayer like a bunch of balloons tied to a donkey's hind legs, those expecting a strong plot and solo RPG experience from a Fallout game are on much firmer ground for complaint. People ask me if I worry about the future of the interactive arts in this era of AAA being a constant stream of soulless exploitative knockoffs, but I'm not worried because we've been here before. At the end of the 90s, games like Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament tried to convince us that we didn't really want artistic single-player PC games when we could just pay to run on hamster wheels all day, and look what the 2000s brought us. Deus Ex, Thief 2, Bioshock, Portal, it's always a phase. In the long run, the only eternal guarantor of success is a quality product well made, ideally with tits on the front. The money to be made from knocking off what's popular and exploiting the stupid always dries up eventually, if only because as the stupids die out from daring each other to headbutt the ceiling fan. Remember a time in those rich and heady days before loot boxes when the trees were still in bloom and your deck still worked, when a game like Just Cause 2 could sell itself on the largeness of its sandbox map, before it had been established over and over again that there is most definitely such a thing as too large a sandbox? I'm glad you agree, Rockstar Games, but you just had to agree, you didn't have to make an entire fucking game illustrating my point. Today, a big sandbox map barely caresses the interior walls of the fickle, novelty-obsessed public's vagina, and my first thought when I saw Just Cause 4 being announced was, why? Surely the character arc of agitator-liberator Rico Rodriguez reached a natural conclusion in the last game when he agi-liberated his own home country, and there isn't much more that can be done in terms of spectacle. I've already seen what happens when an unstable foreign country builds all its fuel depots out of cardboard and oily rags. Silly me, I should have realised. It's a franchise still with name recognition and goodwill, so obviously our corporate masters have to ruin it as part of the ongoing process of crushing our spirits and preparing us for the brain drills. The first thing you'll note as you turn on Just 4's core is that it kind of looks like grilled turds on sesame seed buttock. The graphics are decidedly last gen, everyone kind of looks and animates like characters from Team America World Police, appropriately enough, especially the CIA dude, Sheldon, sporting a silvery beard that looks like he just photobombed a frost giant bukkake shot. I wouldn't normally harp on graphics since I like games like Obra Dinn that can be recreated with cum on a black bedspread, but I think it's appropriate for a game that's supposed to be about spectacle. I mean, this is the world that you insisted we all come and live in, AAA publishers. You're the ones making me update my graphics card drivers more frequently than I scratch my fucking bollocks. If you can't keep up with the cutting edge, then obviously you should kill yourself, that's only fair. I mean, it's not like Just Cause 4 is selling itself on the fucking plot. Rico's on yet another unstable island nation, and there's another dictator, I guess, related in some way to the previous one, but who fucking cares? He shows up once at the start and once at the end while he's getting killed, so he's about as resonant and impactful a character as the bloke who runs Rico's favourite denim jacket shop. Rico's initial attempt to explode his bollocks off fails as his bollocks are protected by a number of weather control devices, and so we must aid the local resistance in bringing them down one by one in preparation for a final decisive bollock assault. But for the most part, the actual threat posed by the evil dictator is a rather conspicuous non-presence in the game. There's not much evidence of propaganda or oppression, and the resistance all seem to be holding up their wobbly table legs with spare assault rifles and helicopters. It's one of those liberate the district style sandboxes, but the process of liberating a district is whatever the complete opposite of spectacular is. You do one samey mission, usually themed around guarding a computer while it slowly hacks something like an obsessive Best Buy employee in the post-apocalypse, then once that's done, you open the map, clumsily paw at the region like a cat watching Watership Down on an iPad, and bam, the resistance takes it over. You couldn't illustrate that a bit? Show us the enemy actually retreating, children skipping hand in hand through newly vacated strongholds, a rainbow appears above a delicate starry-eyed flower of girlhood being gaily spit-roasted. Fuck, any kind of perceivable difference would have helped, as I wingsuit unmolested across the land like a discarded Johnny in a fast-flowing water treatment facility. It would have been nice if I'd had any difficulty whatsoever gliding through non-liberated territory with my foreskin flapping in the wind. For you see, another thing that removes any sense of threat from the game is that the villain's evil army of unstoppable stormtroopers would struggle to muscle a medium-sized dog into a vet's office. Rico Rodriguez must have licked enough lead-painted surfaces as a child to build up an immunity, as he shrugs off bullets like he's using a campsite shower unit. I know Just Cause has never been a series where you have to fret about self-preservation much, but I don't remember combat being so trivial as to be boring. I eventually stopped bothering to open the exotic weapon crates that appear with more frequency than IKEA furniture in student housing, since I never needed anything but the two standard assault rifles the basic enemy soldiers use, what with every platoon that got called in to stop me representing a free ammo refill. Then they move up to calling in tanks, which Rico can steal more easily than he'd steal a parking space, and then come the helicopters, which can be destroyed in seconds by tethering them to the nearest solid object with the pull tether, whereupon they lightly brush against said solid object and instantly detonate like a premature ejaculator on the set of Logan's Run, which brings me to just about the only new gameplay Fuss Jaws Core brings us, more things to do with tethers, which is appropriate because I'm at the end of mine, off. As well as the pull tether, you can attach thrusters and balloons to physics objects if you want to add a festive party atmosphere to the destruction. You can also micromanage the effects with a wide variety of mods that, lacking any other kind of character upgrade system, are all that the game has to reward you with for completing side missions. Thing is, though, all that you really need is a pull tether at full strength. You can bring down most buildings with them without even needing explosives, and everything else is the territory of mindless Gary's Mod style knockabout fun. Yes, it's mildly amusing to attach a balloon to a cow, watch it fly into the air, then pop the balloon and watch the cow slam face first into a meadow as you crow. Now that's what I call grass-fed beef, but none of it's any use for beating the game's challenges, and having you beat challenges to unlock it all feels like a misguided attempt to combine two audiences that want two different things, like tattooing gay porn onto a vagina. All in all, Just for Cash strikes me as an incredibly unnecessary game, which I disinterestedly ploughed through without slowing, as if I were merely rolling down a grassy hill on a mild spring afternoon. Still, finding a way to turn Just Cause of all things into something tedious is an achievement of sorts. Doesn't even end with a proper boss fight, just a bunch of helicopters which were of course immediately brought down by the combined power of 4 bits of string and some suction cups. I think they were planning to have a final boss fight. Right at the end, the main bad guy activates his ultimate doomsday weapon while fleeing and goes, "Ha ha, now you all will die." And Rico jumps onto the doomsday weapon. And I think at that point you were supposed to have a final boss fight with it, but I guess the office party clown's shift was almost over and they had to quickly tie things up. So instead, still in the same cutscene, Rico just goes, "Here's an idea, why don't we not get killed by the doomsday weapon?" And so they don't. End of game. "Grr, curse you, Rico Rodriguez," cries the main villain. "I am defeated once and for all." Somehow.